Can I ride with you? The old woman's voice cut straight through the roar of 60 engines. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. She stood there, 74 years old, small, trembling, just slightly holding a worn envelope against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. And then the photograph fell. It hit the pavement, face up. And Jake Reynolds, a man who had not cried in 30 years, went completely still. His hands stopped. His breath stopped. His whole world stopped. Because the face in that photograph was his. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning because nothing about this morning was supposed to happen the way it did. The morning started the way it always did. Before the sun had fully decided to show itself, before the coffee shops had unlocked their doors, before most of the town had even rolled over in bed, they were already there. Engines warming, leather creaking, the low, steady rumble that people either loved or feared depending on where they were standing when they heard it. 63 motorcycles, 63 riders, and one mission. The annual charity run had become something of a tradition in Millhaven, a small town tucked into the foothills of eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where everybody still knew the name of the family that used to live in any given house, even if that family had been gone for 20 years. The Hells Angels chapter based out of Millhaven wasn't a large one. It wasn't famous. It wasn't the kind of chapter that made national news or showed up in documentaries. But it was respected and it was loyal, and every single year without fail, these men and women loaded up their bikes and rode 47 miles to the Hargrove County Veterans Home and the Millhaven Family Resource Center, showing up with cash donations, supply crates, and enough food to keep both organizations stocked for weeks. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't filmed. Nobody was getting paid. They just did it because somebody had to. Jake Reynolds stood near the front of the formation, one boot propped on the footrest of his 2004 Road King, a cup of gas station coffee cooling in his left hand. He was 61 years old, built wide through the shoulders, the way men get when they've worked outdoors most of their lives, with a silver beard that had crept in over the last decade, and hands that told their own story. Knuckles that had been split and healed and split again. Fingers that moved slower in cold weather than they used to. He'd been doing this ride for 22 consecutive years. He'd been leading it for 14. Danny Reeves, 26 years old and the youngest full-patch member of the chapter, was adjusting the strap on his fuel tank bag when he glanced over at Jake and said, "You think we hit our number this year?" "We always hit our number," Jake said, not looking up from his coffee. "Yeah, but Betancourt's tire shop closed, and they used to put in $2,000 every year, so we always hit our number, Danny." Danny nodded slowly. He'd learned early on that when Jake said something the second time, the conversation was done. Not rudely, just done. Jake wasn't a man who wasted words. He made a statement once, maybe twice, and then he let the world catch up to him. Around them, the street was coming alive. Spectators had started gathering on the sidewalks, not enormous crowds, but steady. Families with kids on shoulders. Old men with coffee cups standing outside the barbershop. A few teenagers who'd heard the engines and wandered over. The local Lions Club had set up a folding table with pastries and juice boxes at the corner of Main and Cedar, which nobody had asked them to do, but nobody was complaining about either. It felt like most years, like a celebration. Like a morning where the whole town quietly agreed that this was worth getting up early for. And then Jake heard it, a voice, not loud, not demanding, not even particularly confident, but clear in the way that very few voices are the kind of clarity that doesn't come from volume, but from intention, from a person who has decided that they are going to say something and they are going to mean every syllable of it. "Excuse me," he turned. She was standing just off the curb, maybe 10 feet from where he stood, and she was nothing like what he expected when a voice like that pulled his attention. She was small, fine-boned, a woman who had maybe been 5'4" once and had given an inch or two of that back to time. Her hair was white blonde, cut short but not severe, and she wore a jacket, actual leather, old and worn, the kind of jacket that had real miles on it. In her arms, pressed against her sternum with both hands, like she was guarding something fragile, she held an envelope. Just an envelope, old and slightly crumpled, the edges soft with handling. Her eyes were blue, not the faded, clouded blue of age, but the kind of blue that felt clear and direct and a little unsettling. If you looked too long, because there was something behind them, something that had survived something. She was looking at Jake. "Excuse me," she said again. "Are you the one in charge?" Jake set down his coffee on the seat behind him. "Depends on what you need." She stopped, started again. "I'd like to come with you on the ride." The nearest riders within earshot went quiet. Jake looked at her, really looked at her the way you look at someone when you're trying to understand what the actual question is, because sometimes people say one thing and mean three others. "You have a bike?" he asked. "No." "Helmet?" "No." "Registered with the event?" "No." She said each no without embarrassment, without apology, just fact. "I know I'm not supposed to simply show up. I know there's a process. I needed to ask. I've been trying to find the right moment to ask for a very long time." Jake scratched the back of his neck. Around him, he was aware that people had stopped pretending to work on their bikes and were just openly watching. Danny Reeves had turned all the way around. Carla Briggs, who road sweep, had walked 3 steps closer without seeming to notice she was doing it. "Ma'am," Jake said, and he kept his voice gentle because there was something in this woman's face that told him she'd already been told no by enough people in enough ways. "I hear you, and I don't want to be rude, but we run this with safety rules that we don't bend for anyone. No passenger without a registered rider, no rider without a helmet, no." "I understand," she said, just that. She didn't argue, didn't push, didn't deflate dramatically or make him feel guilty. She simply accepted the answer the way someone accepts weather. You didn't choose it, but you weren't going to change it, so you just breathed it in. "Thank you for being honest," she said. Most people would have just made up an excuse. She turned to go, and that was when it happened. The envelope slipped. Maybe her grip loosened when she turned. Maybe she'd been holding it so tightly for so long that her fingers had forgotten how to hold it gently. Whatever the reason, the envelope left her hands, and as it fell, something slid out from inside it, and that something hit the pavement with a small, flat sound that shouldn't have stopped anything. But it stopped everything. Because Danny Reeves was the closest person to where it landed, and he bent down instinctively, the way you do when someone drops something, and he picked it up, and he started to hand it back to her, and then he looked at it, and his arm just stopped. "Hey," he said. His voice sounded wrong, the way a voice sounds when the brain is working faster than the mouth. He looked up at Jake. "Hawk, come here." Jake didn't move right away. He was watching the old woman, watching the way she'd half turned back toward Danny with her hand already out for the photograph, watching the patience in her face, the practiced patience of someone who had waited for a great many things in her life. "Come here," Danny said again. And this time his voice had something in it that Jake hadn't heard from Danny in the 2 years he'd known him. Fear wasn't the right word. Recognition wasn't the right word either. It was something in between, the sound of a person who has just seen something they don't have a category for. Jake walked over. Danny turned the photograph so Jake could see it. And Jake Reynolds, a man who had spent 30 years learning not to react to anything, stopped breathing. The photograph was old, not ancient, not the sepia tone kind from the early part of the last century, but old enough that the edges had gone yellow and the colors had flattened and softened the way photographs do when they've been handled many times over many years. Black and white, mostly the kind of print that came from a certain era of camera. It showed 2 men. One was standing beside a motorcycle on a 2-lane highway. The other was sitting on the ground beside that motorcycle, one leg stretched out straight, one arm across his own chest. The man standing was someone Jake didn't know. Tall, broad through the chest, a working man's build, the kind that comes from years of actually doing things with your body and not from a gym. He had a steady, uncomplicated face, the kind of face that looks exactly like what it is. No performance, no pretension. He was looking at the camera, but only barely, the way people do when they're in the middle of something and someone tells them to hold still for a second. The man sitting on the ground was someone Jake knew very well. Because the man sitting on the ground, young and hurt, and looking up at whoever was behind that camera, with an expression that mixed shame and gratitude in a ratio that Jake had never been able to explain to anyone, that man was Jake Reynolds, 23 years old, on the worst night of his life, on a night he had never told anyone about, not one person, not in 38 years. Shupa. Jake heard his own breathing before he heard anything else. He heard the sound of it, ragged, unpracticed, like a man who has just had the air knocked out of him, and is figuring out how to get it back. Jake, Danny's voice came from somewhere off to the side. You okay? He wasn't okay. I was standing in the middle of a street in Millhaven, Tennessee, holding a photograph of the worst and best night of his life. And the woman who owned that photograph was standing 3 feet away from him, watching him with those clear, unsettling blue eyes. He looked up at her. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Where did you get this? She didn't look surprised by the question. She looked like she'd been waiting for it. It belonged to my husband, she said. Thomas Whitmore. Thomas, the name hit him in the chest. Not because he knew it, because he'd spent so long trying to find the name. The face in the photograph, he was holding the tall man with the steady eyes and the working man's hands. Jake had spent the better part of a decade after that night trying to find out who he was. He'd asked around. He'd put out quiet words through the network of riders and road people he knew. He'd driven back to that same highway a dozen times, hoping something would jog loose, hoping someone would remember, hoping the world would just give him this one thing. It never had, and now here she was, Thomas Whitmore's wife, standing in front of him in a worn leather jacket asking for a ride. Thomas Whitmore, Jake said. The name tasted strange in his mouth, something he'd wanted for so long had no right to fit so easily. Your husband, he passed 6 years ago. Her voice was steady. Heart attack, very quick. He was working in the garden one afternoon and then he wasn't. She paused. He would have hated that. He liked things to end with a little more dignity. Jake stared at her. Behind him, he could feel the whole gathering, 63 riders, a crowd of townsfolk, a Lions Club table with pastries going, cold, falling completely and absolutely silent, because humans can feel when something real is happening, even when they don't know what it is. Your husband, Jake said slowly, saved my life. She nodded, just once. I know, she said. The thing about moments that change everything is that they never look the way you think they will. Jake had imagined in the version of this story that lived in the back of his mind that if he ever found the man who stopped for him on that highway, if he ever got the chance to say what he'd wanted to say for 38 years, it would happen somewhere quiet, somewhere private, maybe over a table, maybe with a cup of coffee between them, the kind of conversation that two people who barely know each other have when something enormous needs to be said. I had not imagined it happening on a street in front of 60-some riders in half a town with a charity convoy waiting to depart. He had not imagined it happening with the man's wife instead of the man. He had not imagined it happening on a Tuesday morning in October. But here he was, and here she was, and the thing was he had to say it. He'd spent too long carrying it not to say it. I was 23, he began. His voice came out quiet, and he was aware that people were leaning in slightly, and he didn't care. I was 23 and I was in a bad place. Not hurt yet. Not that night, not then, but bad in here. He touched his chest the way people do when they mean something more than the organ. I'd been riding for 4 hours trying to outrun something that doesn't outrun. You know what I mean? She looked at him steadily. I know exactly what you mean. My bike died on Route 9. Middle of nowhere, 11 o'clock at night, storm coming in from the west. I could see it on the horizon, that kind of flat black line that means you've got maybe 20 minutes. I waved down 6 cars, 6. Every single one of them looked at me, looked right at me, and kept going. Danny was very still beside him. Jake was aware of Carla somewhere behind his left shoulder. Other bikers went past, 3 of them. And I thought, okay, that's it. That's the world. I had some things in my head that night, some thoughts about what was the point, about whether it was worth riding at all, whether it was worth anything at all. He stopped, started again, and then a truck pulled over. The memory was so clear it was almost unbearable. How many times had he replayed it? How many times had he sat with it on night rides in quiet moments, in the years when things were good and he needed to remember why they were good? The truck had been an old F-250 red, the kind of truck that has more miles on it than any truck has a right to have and keeps going anyway out of sheer stubbornness. It pulled up with the hazards on and a man got out without hurrying, not rushing, not making a performance of coming to help. Just getting out of his truck the way you get out when you've arrived somewhere you meant to be. He walked up to Jake sitting on the ground beside his dead bike and he looked at him, and the first thing he said, not "Are you okay?" Not "What happened?" Not "Do you need help?" was "What do you need?" 3 words, not "What's wrong with your bike?" Not "Where are you trying to go?" Not even the performative "Are you all right?" that people say when they've already decided what the answer is. What do you need? Like Jake was a person, like Jake's needs were specific and real and worth asking about directly. And Jake, 23 years old, angry and lost and sitting in the dirt on a dark road with a storm coming and nothing but bad thoughts for company, looked up at this stranger and burst into tears. He hadn't cried in 2 years before that night. He hadn't expected to cry. It just came out, all of it. Everything he'd been running from on that 4-hour ride came out in one long, terrible moment on the side of Route 9. And this stranger, this Thomas Whitmore, this man with the steady eyes and the working hands, didn't back away. Didn't get awkward. Didn't pull out his phone to call someone. He just sat down in the dirt beside Jake and said, "Okay, we've got time. I'm not going anywhere." He stayed, Jake told Eleanor, and his voice was steady now. The way it gets when you've carried something for a long time and setting it down is almost scarier than keeping it. He stayed until the storm passed. He stayed until my buddy Marcus could drive out with a trailer to get my bike. That was almost 3 hours. 3 hours in the dark on the side of a road, and he stayed the whole time. He looked at her. He told me some things that night about his own life, about times he'd been in the dirt, not literally, figuratively. He talked to me like I was a person worth talking to. His voice caught slightly. He let it. He didn't try to fix me. He just stayed. And when Marcus showed up and I was loading the bike, I turned around to thank him, and his truck was already gone. He'd slipped out while I was distracted. A sound somewhere behind Jake, someone clearing their throat in a way that wasn't really about a throat. I tried to find him, Jake continued. For years, I didn't even know his name. I just knew his face. I drove Route 9 looking for that red truck. I put out words with people. Nothing. He looked at Eleanor. I became a better person that night. Not all at once, not perfectly, but I changed direction that night because of him, because of what he showed me about what one person can be for another person. He paused. I needed you to know that. I needed someone in his family to know that. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Around them, nobody moved. Then she said, "He knew." Jake blinked. "What?" "He knew." Her voice was soft, but absolutely certain. "He talked about you. Not by name, he didn't know your name. But he talked about the young man on Route 9. He talked about that night." She paused. "He said the reason he stopped was because he'd once been a young man on a bad road himself, and someone had stopped for him. He said stopping for people was, he called it, paying it forward, before anyone used that phrase. He said it was the only debt that mattered." She shifted the envelope in her hands. "He would have wanted to know what became of you. He wondered. I know he wondered because he talked about it more in his last year than he had in all the years before." Jake had to look away. He looked up at the sky, pale October blue, cold high, the kind of sky that has nothing sentimental in it, which was exactly what he needed, and he breathed. When he looked back at her, something had settled in him. Or maybe it hadn't settled, so much as shifted the weight of 38 years, reorganizing itself, finding a different configuration. "Eleanor," he said, her name. Using it felt important. Not ma'am, not Mrs. Whitmore, her name. "What made you come here today, really?" She considered the question. Not like she didn't know the answer, but like she wanted to give it the right words. "Thomas had a photograph," she said. "That one." She nodded at the picture Jake was still holding. He'd carried it since the night it was taken. "I don't know who took it. Maybe Marcus, you said his name was. I don't know how Thomas ended up with it, but he kept it in his desk drawer for 40 years. She reached out and Jake gave it back to her. She looked at it for a moment before returning it to the envelope. "After he died, I spent a long time going through his things. Everyone told me to take my time. Everyone said I was handling it beautifully." She said those last two words in a way that made clear what she thought of them. "I wasn't handling it beautifully. I was drowning. I was drowning slowly, and I had learned to do it very quietly, which people mistook for composure." No one spoke. No one was going to. "Thomas used to talk about this ride," Eleanor continued. "He knew about the charity run, not Hell's Angels specifically, but this event. One of his army buddies used to participate years ago. Thomas always wanted to ride in it. He never did. He kept putting it off. You know how people put things off." She looked around at the assembled riders, all of these people who had said nothing and were not going to say anything because they were holding their breath the same way Jake was. "After he died, I thought I'll do it for him. I'll come to the ride. I'll carry his photo. I'll feel close to him. She stopped, shook her head slightly like she was clearing something away. That's the story I told myself. But when I got here this morning and I saw all of you and I heard the engines, she looked at the road. I realized I didn't come here for Thomas. The quiet around them deepened. I came here for me. Jake looked at her. He thought about a young man on a dark road who had been running from something that couldn't be outrun, and a stranger who had sat down next to him in the dirt. He thought about what it costs a person to show up for themselves out loud in front of other people after a long time of not doing it. He thought about what it means to be seen. Danny Reeves, 26 years old, who had never heard any of this and who was still holding the hand grip of his bike like it was the only solid thing in a suddenly liquid world, said quietly, "Hawk." Jake looked at him. Danny didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Jake turned back to Eleanor. "You mentioned you don't have a helmet," he said. "No," she agreed. "The Prospect trailer has extras. We keep them for media people who ride along sometimes." He paused. "You know how to hold on to a passenger bar?" She tilted her head slightly. "I am 74 years old. I have held on to things my entire life. I think I can manage a passenger bar." Somewhere behind Jake, Carla Briggs made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was clearly a relative of one. "You'll ride with me," Jake said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Because of Thomas." "No," Jake said. He said it the way he said things once clearly, with the full weight of his meaning. "Because you showed up, because you asked, because the person who asks for what they need is exactly the kind of person who belongs on this road." He paused. "Thomas would have said the same thing, I think." She held his gaze for a long measuring moment. Then Eleanor Whitmore straightened her spine, and there it was, the posture of a woman who had been standing up straight through difficult things since long before anyone in this street was born. And she said, "All right." "All right," Jake agreed, and the morning continued. But not the way anyone had planned. Because, as the chapter president, a barrel-chested man named Ray Fender, Oakes began moving people toward the formation as the engines started warming louder, as people began pulling on helmets and checking mirrors. Danny Reeves came back to Jake's side with something in his hand that he hadn't had a minute ago. "She had 2 envelopes," Danny said. "The one that fell that had the photo of you and Thomas. But she had another one inside her jacket. It fell when I helped her get the extra helmet." He held it out. I don't know what this is, Hawk." Jake looked at the envelope, then looked at Eleanor, who was 10 feet away talking to Carla about the helmet strap, and either hadn't noticed Danny pick it up or was deliberately not noticing. "Give it to her," Jake said immediately. "I know I'm going to, but I looked at what was inside just to see if it was valuable, and Hawk." Danny stopped. His voice did the strange thing again, the thing that wasn't fear and wasn't recognition, and was something in between. "She's not here just because of the photo. She's not here just because of Thomas." He opened the flap of the second envelope. Inside was a photograph, but not like the first one. The first one had been personal, 2 men on a roadside, a moment caught by chance. This one was different. This one showed a group of people standing in front of a row of motorcycles in what was unmistakably Millhaven. You could see the corner of the hardware store on Cedar in the background. And they were standing under a banner that Jake could read clearly even in the age-softened print. The banner said, "First Annual Millhaven Charity Ride in Service to Those Who Served Us." The first ride, the very first one. The one that had happened before Jake's chapter took it over. The one that had been organized by a handful of people 15 years before Jake Reynolds ever showed up in Millhaven. And standing in the center of the group beneath that banner, with his arm around a woman whose face Jake didn't recognize from this angle, was Thomas Whitmore. Jake stared at the photograph. He heard his own heartbeat. Because what this meant, what this second photograph meant, what it changed about everything he thought he understood about this morning, about Eleanor Whitmore, about why she was really here. "Jake?" Fender's voice came from the front of the formation 100 feet away. "We ready?" Jake looked up. He looked at Eleanor, who was now holding her helmet and listening to Carla with a polite expression and absolutely the eyes of a woman who is aware that something is happening behind her. He looked at the photograph. He looked at Danny. "Not yet," Jake said. He walked toward Eleanor Whitmore. She turned before he reached her. She had known it was coming. Of course she had. Whatever else Eleanor Whitmore was, she was not a woman who missed things. Jake held out the second envelope. For a moment she didn't take it. She looked at it in his hand and something crossed her face, not quite guilt, not quite relief, something more complicated and more human than either. Then she took it. You were going to tell me, Jake said. Eventually. Yes, she said simply. But you wanted to see, he stopped. Thought about it. You wanted to see if we knew, without you having to say it. She looked at him. I wanted to see, she said carefully, what this place was really like, before I gave you anything, before you knew who I was, or what I carried. She looked down at the envelope. Thomas helped start this ride, he and 4 other men, before your chapter took it over, which he always said was the best thing that could have happened to it for the record. He helped start it, and then he stepped back because he never wanted credit. He would have been furious with me for bringing this. She almost smiled. That's partly why I brought it. Jake was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you just come forward years ago when he died? You could have people would have wanted to know. The chapter would have wanted to know the history. I know, she said. But that would have been Thomas's story, told by Thomas's widow after Thomas died. She looked up at him. I didn't want my first story here to be about being someone's widow. The words landed. They landed hard the way true things land. Jake thought about what she'd said earlier, I came here for me, and he understood now what it cost to say that. How long it had been building. How many mornings she'd looked at that second envelope and thought not yet. And how this morning, for whatever reason, in whatever combination of grief and courage, and something else that didn't have a clean name this morning, she'd put both envelopes in her jacket and walked to the end of her street and called a taxi to Main and Cedar. Okay, Jake said. Just that. Okay, Electner said back. And if the second photograph changed anything, it changed everything, as a matter of fact. And Jake already knew there were going to be conversations later. Longer ones with more people. He didn't let it change the moment they were standing in. Because the moment they were standing in was this: a woman had showed up and asked for a ride. And the answer was yes. Everything else could wait. Ray Fender Oaks met Jake halfway back to the front of the formation with the expression of a man who has been chapter president for 11 years and has learned that when Jake Reynolds goes quiet, something significant has happened. You going to brief me? Fender asked. Later. How much later? After the ride. Fender looked past Jake at Eleanor Whitmore, who was standing very straight with a borrowed helmet in the crook of her arm and the 2 envelopes tucked back inside her jacket, talking to Carla Briggs now, as though they'd known each other for years. Fender looked back at Jake. She know the route? No. She gonna be comfortable on the back of your bike for 47 miles. She seems like a woman who'd be comfortable anywhere she decided to be. Fender considered this. Fair enough, he said, and he walked back to his own bike. Danny materialized at Jake's right shoulder. What's in the second envelope? Thomas Whitmore helped found this ride, Jake said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. So she's not just some lady who showed up, Danny said slowly. She's not just anything, Jake said. Don't say that again. Danny nodded once quickly. But to answer your question, Jake continued, no, she is not just someone who showed up. She is the wife of one of the men who built this thing. She's the woman who kept his photographs for 40 years. And she is, he paused. She is a person who got up this morning and decided she wasn't done yet. He looked at Danny. That makes sense to you. Danny thought about it. Yeah, he said. Yeah, that makes sense. Good. Jake picked up his helmet. Tell Fender we're rolling in 5. Bussin' in. When Jake walked back to Eleanor to help her mount, she was studying the collection of bikes around her with the focused, organized attention of someone who actually knows what they're looking at. You've been around motorcycles, Jake said. Thomas had 3 over the years. I never rode one myself, but I knew how to maintain them. She looked at his Road King. That's a 04. Yeah. Clean, she said. And then she lifted one leg and swung herself up to the pillion with a steadiness that made Danny Reeves, watching from 6 feet away, visibly recalibrate whatever assumptions he'd arrived with that morning. Jake settled onto his seat. He felt her hands find the grab rail. No hesitation, no tentative searching, just hands that found what they needed and held it. Ready, he asked. He felt her exhale behind him. And then she said something so quietly that Jake almost missed it under the sound of 63 engines coming to life around them. She said, Thomas, look where I am. The convoy moved, 63 motorcycles and one elderly woman who had asked for a ride rolling through the streets of Millhaven in the pale October morning. While the townsfolk on the sidewalks watched, and some of them waved, and some of them pressed their hands to their mouths without entirely knowing why. Eleanor Whitmore held the grab rail and felt the road beneath her. 47 miles ahead, the veterans were waiting. And something neither she nor Jake nor any of the 63 people around her could have named exactly had already changed. It had been changing maybe since a man named Thomas Whitmore pulled over on Route 9 on a stormy night 38 years ago. It had been changing since a woman picked up 2 envelopes and put them in her jacket and called a taxi. It had been changing since the morning began, and it wasn't finished yet. The convoy had been rolling for 11 minutes when Carla Briggs pulled up beside Jake's Road King and held up 3 fingers, 3 miles out. Jake nodded once and Carla fell back. Behind him, Eleanor hadn't said a word since they left Millhaven. No nervous commentary, no anxious checking, no request to slow down. She held the grab rail with a steadiness that Jake could feel through the frame of the bike. Not white-knuckled tension, not the rigidity of fear, but something measured and deliberate. The grip of a woman who had decided to be somewhere and was fully present in that decision. He found himself thinking about that. About how many people spend their whole lives only half present in the things they've chosen. How rare it actually was the person who shows up all the way. He'd met maybe 7 in his life. Thomas Whitmore had been one of them. He was starting to understand where Thomas had learned it. The road curved and the town thinned behind them, and Jake let the rhythm of the ride settle into the space where thoughts usually got loud. Normally it worked. Normally 47 miles of October road was enough to quiet whatever needed quieting. Not today. Because today the second envelope was sitting in Eleanor Whitmore's jacket pocket, and everything Jake thought he knew about this morning had just rearranged itself into a shape he hadn't seen coming. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just been a good man on a dark road. Thomas Whitmore had built this road, the metaphorical one, the annual road, the charity road, that Jake had been leading for 14 years without knowing who first drew the map. That wasn't a coincidence. Jake didn't believe in coincidences. What he believed in was the way things waited. The way a truth could sit quiet for decades, patient as stone, until the exact right morning when someone picked up an old envelope and walked to the end of her street. I thought about Thomas pulling over on Route 9 and asking, "What do you need?" Just like that, plain and direct, no performance. And he thought about Eleanor standing at the edge of a crowd of bikers with 2 envelopes and a worn leather jacket asking, "Can I ride with you?" Just like that, plain and direct, no performance. The apple, Jake thought, does not fall far. Even when the tree is gone. He pressed the throttle a half degree harder and felt Eleanor shift her weight behind him with easy precision, adjusting to the acceleration, without startling, without gripping tighter, as if she'd done it 100 times. Maybe she hadn't ridden, but she'd lived beside someone who did. That left its own kind of knowledge. Danny Reeves was 2 bikes back on Jake's left, and Jake could see him in the mirror the way the kid kept glancing over at Jake's pillion. The way he'd go back to watching the road and then glance over again like he was trying to solve a math problem, and the answer kept moving. Danny was a good rider and a decent human being, and still young enough that the world surprised him regularly, which Jake considered a virtue rather than a weakness. The surprise of this morning was going to stay with Danny for a long time. Jake understood that. It was going to stay with all of them. Fender's voice crackled in Jake's earpiece. "Hawk, got a second?" Jake tapped the mic button twice shorthand for "I'm listening." "Just got a call from Hargrove County. Meridian Bridge is down. Construction crew expanded the closure this morning, takes out our Route 17 crossing. We've got a pause." The sound of Fender doing the mental arithmetic that he always did, the careful, systematic way he'd approach a blocked road. "We've got nothing clean. Every alternate I'm looking at adds 40 minutes minimum and takes us through the school zone during drop-off." Jake kept his eyes on the road. He tapped the mic. "How long and until we need to decide? We're 4 miles from the fork. Maybe 8 minutes at this speed." 8 minutes. He thought about the veterans at the Hargrove County home who'd been told the convoy was arriving at 10:30. He thought about the staff at the Family Resource Center who'd rescheduled their entire Tuesday around the delivery. He thought about 63 people who'd gotten up before dawn on a Tuesday in October because they believed this mattered. He tapped the mic again. "I'll figure it out." He heard Fender not quite believe him, but Fender said, "Copy," and went quiet. Jake reached up and tapped Eleanor's hand on the grab rail. One tap, hold on, and then he eased the bike to the shoulder, smooth and gradual, and came to a stop. The convoy read the move instantly. Ripple effect backwards, 63 bikes, slowing and pulling right with the practiced fluidity of people who've ridden together long enough to move like one organism. In 30 seconds, the whole formation was stopped on the shoulder of Route 17 engines idling. Fender pulled up beside Jake. His face said everything his voice hadn't. Bridge closure, Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. She was already half turned on the pillion, looking back down the road they'd come from, her head moving in small, precise increments, the way someone moves when they're reading a mental map. That's the only reason you'd stop here, she said. There's nothing else on this stretch that would hold up a convoy. Meridian Bridge, Fender confirmed. Construction expanded this morning. She made the sound of someone whose suspicion has just been confirmed. I thought they might. I drove past there last Thursday, and the equipment staging was wrong for a single lane closure. Fender looked at Jake. Jake looked at Eleanor. You know another way, Jake asked. Depends on what equipment you have, she said. Where are you crossing Hargrove County? Veterans Home, then Family Resource. She nodded slowly, not like she was thinking, like she was confirming something she already knew. There's an old service road off Miller Creek that comes out behind the county agricultural center. From there, you're half a mile from the Veterans Home. Road hasn't been on any map I've seen in 20 years, but it's still maintained. County keeps it for equipment access. Gravel for the first section, packed dirt after that. Fender said carefully, How do you know about it? I drove it every winter for 11 years, Eleanor said. I volunteered with the County Emergency Management Office from 1987 to 2002. We used that road when storm flooding took out the main routes. It'll hold motorcycles. It won't hold a semi, but it'll hold motorcycles. The word if was sitting in the air between all three of them, and all three of them knew it. How old is your information? Jake asked. Eleanor met his eyes. I drove it last spring. Fender made a sound in his throat. Not disbelief, more like the sound of a man who has just had his world slightly reorganized. Why'd you drive it last spring? She looked at him calmly. Because I drove it every spring, to make sure it was still passable. She paused. I knew this ride used Route 17. I knew Meridian Bridge was aging. I've been checking that alternate route for 4 years. The silence that landed on that was different from the silence earlier. The earlier silence had been about emotion, about a photograph in a dead man, and 38 years of wondering. This silence was about something else. This silence was about a 74-year-old woman who had shown up this morning asking for a ride, carrying 2 envelopes and no helmet, and who had also been quietly, methodically, without a word to anyone, maintaining a contingency route for an event she wasn't even part of. Danny's voice came from 3 bikes back. Did she have a backup plan for our ride that we didn't know about? Nobody answered him. Because the answer was yes, and the implications of that yes were still spreading outward. Eleanor, Jake said, and he kept his voice even because this required evenness. When you came this morning, when you showed up and asked to ride, you already knew about the bridge. She didn't look away. I thought there was a possibility, yes. And if we'd turned you away, I would have found another way to make sure you knew about the alternate route. She said it plainly. I wasn't going to let the ride fail because of a bridge closure. Not this ride. She looked at the road ahead, and something moved in her face that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite pride, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. Thomas would never have forgiven me. Jake was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, Fender, we're taking a detour. Fender, who had been chapter president for 11 years and had never once in those 11 years heard Jake defer navigation to a stranger, looked at Jake with an expression that was equal parts professional skepticism and personal awe. You trust this? Jake looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him with those clear, steady, unsettling blue eyes. Yeah, Jake said, I trust it. Fender pulled back a phone and started relaying coordinates to the back of the convoy. Danny Reeves let out a breath that was audible even over the idling engines, and Eleanor Whitmore settled back against the pillion and pointed to the left. Miller Creek Road, she said. 2 miles ahead, there's a green fence post that's been leaning since 2010. You'll see a gap in the tree line just past it. That's the turn. A leaning green fence post, Jake repeated. It's been leaning at the same angle for 6 years, she said. It's not going anywhere. And it wasn't. The convoy moved. The turn was exactly where she said it would be. The road was exactly what she described: gravel first, then packed dirt, negotiable, manageable, not comfortable, but entirely possible for 63 motorcycles moving in controlled formation. The service road ran along the back edge of a property line and then curved onto a county access road and came out as she had promised half a mile from the Hargrove County Veterans Home, 4 minutes behind schedule, not 40. When Fender confirmed their position over the radio and the Veterans Home came into view and the convoy made its final turn, Jake felt something ripple through the formation behind him. 63 people who had been tense on the detour, managing unfamiliar road, operating on trust, all arriving at destination. The cheer that went up when they pulled into the parking lot of the Veterans Home was the loudest Jake had heard in 22 years of this ride. From behind him, very quietly, Eleanor said, "There we go." And she sounded not triumphant, not relieved even. She sounded like someone who has quietly done something they promised themselves they'd do and is taking exactly one moment to acknowledge it before moving forward. Jake understood that too. He understood it very well. The parking lot of the Veterans Home was organized chaos for the next 20 minutes. People unloading cargo, greeting staff, moving crates. The particular cheerful noise of a large group of people who have arrived somewhere they meant to be and are now doing what they came to do. Jake stayed close to Eleanor, not hovering, not managing, just present, in the way he'd learned that people sometimes needed a person to be present. She didn't need much. She moved through the Veterans Home with the ease of someone who'd been in such places before. She spoke to the residents without loudness and without the particular brand of performative cheerfulness that well-meaning people sometimes brought to these places, the kind that was more about making the visitor feel good about themselves than actually connecting with the person being visited. Eleanor didn't perform, she just talked. Jake watched her sit down across from a 90-year-old Korean War veteran named Earl, who hadn't spoken more than 6 words to any visitor in 8 months, and within 4 minutes she had him describing the exact topography of a hill outside Incheon. She didn't exclaim over everything he said. She asked follow-up questions that proved she was actually listening. She laughed when he said something dry and funny, and she didn't fill the pauses when he stopped to collect himself. When Jake came back from helping unload the supply crates, she and Earl were still talking. Earl was crying. Not badly, the quiet tears of someone who has unexpectedly been seen by another person, which is a different thing entirely from grief. Carla Briggs appeared at Jake's elbow. "She's something else," Carla said. "Yeah," Jake said. "Where'd she come from?" "Mill Haven. Lives about 8 blocks from our chapter house." Carla absorbed this. 8 blocks. All this time. "All this time," Jake agreed. "Thomas Whitmore," Carla said, and she'd heard the story word had moved through the convoy the way it always did, person to person, at gas stations and rest stops and over engines. "I knew that name sounded familiar. My dad used to talk about the early charity runs. He used to say there was a man named Whitmore who got the whole thing organized, made the Veterans Home the first stop." She paused. "I thought he'd made it up. I thought it was one of those stories that grows over time." "It wasn't made up," Jake said. "No," Carla agreed. "I can see that." They watched Eleanor cross the room to a second resident, a woman this time late 80s, sitting alone with a book she didn't appear to be reading. Eleanor sat down across from her and said something, and the woman looked up and the book went down and they began to talk. "She did this before," Jake said. It wasn't a question. "She absolutely did this before," Carla confirmed. "Look at her. She doesn't think about what to say. She just says it." Which was true. Eleanor Whitmore moved through that room the way people move through places they've loved before, not familiar with this specific room, but familiar with what rooms like this need from the people who enter them. Presence, attention, the willingness to hear something difficult without flinching. Danny came up on Jake's right. One of the guys up front, old veteran, didn't catch his name, asked who the lady was. "I said she was riding with us." He said she reminded him of his wife. Danny paused. "His wife died last year." Jake didn't say anything. "I didn't know what to say to that," Danny admitted. "So I just said she was someone special." And he said, yeah, he could tell. And then he went back to watching her talk to Earl. They stood there together, 3 of them. Jake and Carla and Danny, watching Eleanor Whitmore move through a room full of people who had spent their lives being walked past, and the silence between the 3 of them was the good kind. The kind that means you're all thinking the same thing and there's nothing to add. What broke it was Jake's phone. He stepped away to take the call, moving toward the hallway. It was Marcus Webb, who'd been Jake's closest friend since long before Hell's Angels. Marcus, who'd driven out with a trailer on a stormy night 38 years ago on Route 9. "Heard you had an interesting morning," Marcus said by way of greeting. Word traveled fast. Who told you? Danny sent me a text from the road. Said you'd tell me the whole story, but he wanted me to know the short version. A pause. Jake. Thomas Whitmore's wife. Yeah. Thomas Whitmore, who, yeah. The man from Route 9. Yeah, Marcus. The silence on the phone was the kind Marcus used when he was processing something that had too many layers to process quickly. Marcus was not a fast processor. He was an accurate one eventually, but he needed his time. You told her, Marcus finally said. It wasn't a question. I told her. All of it. All of it. How'd she take it? Jake thought about Eleanor's face when he'd said your husband saved my life. The single small nod, the certainty in her voice when she said I know. Like someone who already knew, he said, because she already knew. Because Thomas talked about that night. She said he talked about it more in his last year than he had before. The sound of Marcus breathing, slow, steady. The sound of a man who has just had 38 years reorganized into something that almost makes sense. I was there, Marcus said quietly. On Route 9, I was the one who took the picture. I had a disposable camera in my truck. I don't even remember taking the photo. I must have taken it while you were loading the bike. He stopped. I never gave it to Thomas. He had it, Jake said. I know, I don't know how. I never gave it to him. Marcus's voice had gone somewhere careful and private. Maybe I left it on the truck seat when he was helping load. Maybe he picked it up thinking it was nothing and then got it developed and saw. He stopped again. He kept it for 40 years. He kept it for 40 years, Jake confirmed. Then she kept it. Then she kept it. Another long pause. Then Marcus said, she came to the ride. She came to the ride. And she knew the alternate route. She's known it for 4 years. She's been checking it every spring since 2021. The pause on Marcus's end was different this time. Sharper. She knew about the bridge. She suspected. Jake. Marcus's voice came out very quiet. She didn't just come for Thomas. She came to make sure you were going to be okay. The hallway Jake was standing in went very still. Not because anything had changed in the hallway. The hallway was the same as it had been 10 seconds ago, fluorescent lights, linoleum floor, the distant sound of voices from the main room. But something shifted inside Jake's chest the same way things had been shifting all morning. That feeling of a truth moving from one place in you to another, from the theoretical to the actual. She hadn't come just to fulfill a dead man's wish. She hadn't come just for herself either, though that was real. That was true, he believed her when she said it. She had come because she had been paying attention. For 4 years she'd been paying attention to this ride, checking the route, verifying the alternate, making sure that if something went wrong, there would be a person who knew. A quiet guardian, invisible, doing the work that nobody asked her to do and nobody knew she was doing. Thomas Whitmore, Jake thought, had not been the only one who knew how to show up. He'd just been the first one Jake had seen do it. I need to go back in, Jake told Marcus. Yeah, go. A beat. Jake, what's she like? Jake thought about it. She's like him, he said. She's very much like him. He hung up and walked back into the main room. Eleanor was now sitting beside an older man in a wheelchair, mid-90s. Jake guessed the kind of age where the body has become mostly a commitment, and she was leaning forward with her elbows on her knees, which was not a posture of polite attention, but of actual engagement. The real forward lean of someone who is genuinely pulled into what they're hearing. The man in the wheelchair was talking about a place called Pusan. Eleanor was nodding. Not the performative nod, the real one. The nod that says, I'm with you, I understand, keep going. Jake stood in the doorway and watched, and he thought about the second envelope. The second photograph, Thomas at the first annual ride standing beneath the banner arm, around a woman whose face Jake hadn't been able to see from the angle of the shot. He'd been so focused on Thomas that he hadn't fully thought about who was beside him. He thought about it now. He crossed the room to where Eleanor was sitting, and he waited, and when she glanced up at him, he made the quiet gesture that meant, when you have a minute. She gave the tiniest nod and turned back to the man in the wheelchair. 3 minutes later, she came to stand beside Jake near the window. The photograph, Jake said quietly. The second one. Thomas at the first ride. Who was the woman beside him? Eleanor's expression shifted. Something small, something private. That was me, she said. Jake went still. I was there, she said. I helped organize the first ride. The logistics, the phone calls, the permit applications, the coordination with the veterans home. Thomas did the recruiting, talking to writers, getting people involved. I did the paperwork. The corner of her mouth moved in what wasn't quite a smile. I was always the one who did the paperwork. So you didn't just know about this ride because of Thomas, Jake said slowly. You built it. We built it, she corrected. Together. We built it together, and then life got busy and we handed it off, and she looked toward the room. We always said we'd come back. The way people say things. She paused. We never came back. And then he died, and I thought, she stopped, started again. I thought maybe I'd missed the chance. You didn't miss it, Jake said. No, she agreed. I didn't. She said it without drama. Just fact, the way she said most things. But Jake could hear the weight behind it. 6 years of mornings when she looked at those 2 envelopes and thought, not yet 6 years of being Thomas's widow. And everyone's example of grace under grief. 6 years of doing it quietly and correctly. And then one Tuesday in October, when something had shifted enough that she put both envelopes in her jacket and made a call for a taxi. 6 years is a long time to hold something. He knew something about that. There's one more thing, Eleanor said. Jake looked at her. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket, not the envelopes, something else. A folded piece of paper that had been there separately, tucked behind the envelopes, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who files things in order of importance. She held it out to him. He unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten on plain paper in a handwriting that was not Eleanor's, he could tell, because the letters were larger and more deliberate, the handwriting of someone who did not write often and was thinking about each word. At the top, in the same careful hand, was a name. Jake. Just that. Jake. No last name, because Thomas hadn't known the last name. But he'd known the first name Marcus had told him, apparently during the loading of the bike, because Marcus didn't understand the significance of not saying it, and Thomas had remembered. Remembered. Jake. Jake's hands tightened on the paper. He wrote it in his last year, Eleanor said quietly. He wrote several letters that year. To people he felt he'd not failed. Thomas would never have said that word, but people he felt he might not have done enough for. People he'd touched lightly and wondered about. She paused. He didn't know how to find you. He asked me to hold on to it in case there was ever a chance. Jake read the letter. He read it once quickly, the way you read something, when your eyes want to move faster than your comprehension allows, and then he folded it. Then he unfolded it and read it again. The letter was not long. Thomas Whitmore had not been a long letter writer. Eleanor had already told him that he'd rather do something than write about doing it. But it was complete. It said the things it meant to say without wrapping them in language that softened them. And what it said was this, that Thomas had thought about Jake, had carried him the same way Jake had carried Thomas, had looked for him in the roads and the faces of the young men he encountered over the years, hoping for a sign that the direction had held, had believed because Thomas was the kind of man who chose to believe that it had. And at the end, in the same careful handwriting, Thomas had written, "You don't owe me anything. Nobody who stops for another person on a dark road is doing it to collect a debt. But if you want to do something with it, pay it forward. Stop for someone, sit with them, ask what they need. That's all. That's the whole thing." Jake stood very still. The main room continued around him. Voices, the sound of equipment being moved in the adjacent supply room. The low murmur of 63 people doing what they'd come to do. Eleanor was watching him. "He wrote that before he knew who I was," Jake said. "He wrote that not knowing I'd already." His voice stopped. "I've been stopping for people for 30 years. I made a promise to myself on Route 9 that I would stop, every time, for anyone. I never broke that." "I know," Eleanor said. "How do you know?" Because she said simply, "You have the same way of looking at people that Thomas had." The same, she searched for the word, the same weight, like you're actually seeing them. People who've made that kind of promise, who've kept it, it changes how you look at people. It becomes permanent. She paused. "I recognized it the second you turned around and looked at me on that street." Jake looked down at the letter. Thomas Whitmore had written him a letter. Thomas Whitmore, who had sat in the dirt beside a crying 23-year-old on a dark road, who had stayed for 3 hours, who had slipped away without being thanked, who had built the first version of this ride, who had kept a photograph for 40 years, who had carried an unanswered question about a stranger. The same way that stranger had carried an unanswered question about him, Thomas Whitmore had written him a letter, and his wife had carried it here. Eleanor, Jake said. She looked at him steadily. Thank you. She nodded, just once. The nod of a person receiving something that is real and not overstating it and not dismissing it. The exact right response, which she had clearly over 74 years, developed a precision for. And then Danny Reeves came through the door from the supply room at a pace that was clearly urgent without being panicked. The young man's version of controlled urgency, which mostly meant he was jogging lightly and his eyes were wide. Hawk, he said, reaching Jake's elbow. Fender needs you outside, right now. What is it? Danny glanced at Eleanor, then back at Jake. It's about the route, he said. The alternate Miller Creek. Something happened. Jake was already moving. What happened? County sent an alert. There's a vehicle stuck on the service road. Agricultural truck they think must have gone in from the other end after we cleared through. It's blocking the road completely. He kept pace with Jake through the room toward the exit. We can still get to the Family Resource Center, but not by the way we came. We need a second alternate. And Fender's been on the phone for 10 minutes and there isn't one. Jake pushed through the exterior door. Fender was there standing by his bike phone in hand, the expression of a man who has run the numbers 3 different ways and gotten the same bad answer each time. No clean route, Fender said immediately. Everything that works for us goes through the school zone. Drop-off ends at 8:50. That gives us a 9 o'clock opening. If we wait, but that puts us at the resource center 40 minutes late, and he checked his phone. They've got their Tuesday meal program starting at 10, and they need us out before then to set up. Jake stood there. He heard the door behind him. Eleanor stepped out. She'd followed. He looked at her. She was already, he could see it in her face, the same precise attention she'd given to Earl's story about Inshin, the same focused presence. She was already working through it. How far is the school zone? She asked. 2 miles from here on the direct route, Fender said. And drop-off ends at 8:50. She looked at her watch. It's 8:37. If you leave now, you reach the zone at 8:52. That's not clear, Fender said. No, she agreed. But the resource center is 1.4 miles past the school. If you hold at the zone entrance for 8 minutes, not 40, you clear drop-off and reach the resource center by 9:14. She looked at Jake. Is 9:14 workable? Jake looked at Fender. Fender was doing the math with the pained expression of a man who wants to find a flaw and is not finding one. They need us out by 10, he said. 9:14 gives us 46 minutes. He paused. It's workable. 8 minutes, Danny said from behind Jake. We hold for 8 minutes. At the zone entrance, Eleanor said, not blocking it. There's a county parking area on the north side of the school property. It's public access open at 7. You can stage there. Fender looked at her with an expression that was past surprise now and into something quieter and more serious. You know that parking area? I know that school, Eleanor said. I went to that school. Graduated 1970. A pause. The parking area didn't exist in 1970, but I've driven past it enough times. Fender almost laughed. Almost. All right, he said. He looked at Jake. She's right again. She's right again, Jake confirmed. Danny said quietly but audibly, is she just always going to be right? Nobody answered that either, but the answer was looking increasingly like yes. The convoy staged and held and moved when Eleanor's watch reached the 8-minute mark, with the precision of someone who had spent years timing things correctly, because incorrect timing in emergency management had consequences. They reached the Family Resource Center at 9:16, 2 minutes later than Eleanor's estimate, because one of the bikes had a momentary tire concern that cost 90 seconds, and they arrived to a parking lot where the Resource Center's director, a woman named Pamela, was standing by the door with her hands pressed together and relief visible on her face from 30 feet away. We heard about the bridge, Pamela said as Jake pulled in. We thought you were going to have to cancel. We had good navigation, Jake said. He looked back at the convoy unfolding behind him, all 63 bikes, finding spaces, people dismounting, the cheerful, organized noise of a group arriving at purpose. And then he looked at Eleanor, who had climbed off the pillion with the same easy steadiness she'd climbed on with and was standing beside the bike, adjusting her jacket. She caught him looking. Don't, she said. Don't what? Don't look at me like I did something exceptional. I knew a road and I knew a parking area, that's all. That's not all, Jake said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away toward the resource center where a line of people was already beginning to form at the door. Families, mostly some with young children, some older, the particular mix of people who needed this place and were glad it existed, and perhaps preferred not to look too hard at how close it had come to not happening today. It almost wasn't enough, she said quietly. The alternate route, the school, any of it. One more problem and we'd have been out of options. But we weren't. No, she was quiet for a moment. Thomas used to say that problems come in threes. One to show you the challenge, one to show you your limits, and the third to show you what you're made of. She paused. I always thought that was a little too tidy. Life doesn't usually organize itself into threes. No, Jake agreed. But this morning, as she said, I think he might have had a point. And Jake thought about that, the bridge, the block service road, the school zone. 3 problems in order, each one requiring something different. Knowledge, flexibility, precision. He thought about a woman who had for 4 years quietly made herself ready for all 3. He thought about Thomas Whitmore writing a letter to a man he couldn't find saying, stop, for someone, sit with them, ask what they need. I thought about what it means to prepare for something, not because anyone told you to, not because there was credit in it, but because you love something, to ride a mission, a town, a husband's legacy, enough to protect it in secret. Carla came up beside him as the unloading began. You okay, Hawk? Jake watched Eleanor cross the parking lot toward the resource center door, where a small girl, maybe 4 years old, holding the handle of a rolling cart with the focused importance of a very young person, doing a very important job, stopped and looked up at her with the frank curiosity of children, which is not rude and is not polite, just direct. Eleanor stopped. She crouched down. She said something to the girl. The girl said something back. Eleanor laughed, not the polite social laugh, the real one, the kind that came from somewhere undefended. Yeah, Jake told Carla. I'm okay. He folded Thomas Whitmore's letter carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep, and put it in his inner jacket pocket. Then he walked toward the resource center and the 63 people who had somehow gotten here anyway. Somewhere in the back of his mind, barely formed, was the beginning of a thought. A thought about a woman who had built something and then stepped back and then spent years maintaining it from a distance and then come forward. A thought about what it meant to come forward. A thought about what it meant to be seen, really seen, not as someone's widow, not as a charming story about an old woman who showed up, but as herself. He hadn't finished the thought yet, but it was there. And it wasn't going anywhere. The Family Resource Center smelled like coffee and floor wax, in the particular kind of wax, in the particular kind of hope that exists in places that run on goodwill and not much else. Jake had been inside it dozens of times over 22 years, and it always smelled the same, which he'd come to think of as a kind of reliability. Not everything needed to change to prove it was still alive. Pamela, the director, had been running the place for 16 years. She was 53, efficient in the way of people who have learned to do a great deal with not enough. And she had a habit of moving through rooms at a pace that gently communicated to everyone around her that there was work to be done and she intended to do it. She'd thanked the convoy at the door, shaken hands with Fender, gestured her staff toward the unloading operation, and then she'd turned to say something to Jake and stopped. Because Eleanor Whitmore was standing behind Jake, Pamela went very still. Not the stillness of not recognizing, the stillness of recognizing something you weren't prepared to see. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor said, hello, Pamela. Jake looked between them. Pamela said carefully, the way you say something when you're trying to establish what is actually happening. You came with the convoy. I rode with Jake, Eleanor said. Is that all right? Is that? Pamela stopped. A small laugh came out of her that was clearly involuntary. The laugh of someone whose emotional wiring has been briefly overloaded. Yes, of course it's all right. She looked at Jake. Do you know who this is? I'm starting to, Jake said. Eleanor ran our volunteer program for 8 years, Pamela said. Before I was director, she ran it under the previous director and trained half the people I work with today. She turned back to Eleanor. We've been trying to reach you for the spring fundraiser. You never answered. Something crossed Eleanor's face, not guilt, not embarrassment, but a kind of honest acknowledgement, the face of someone who knows they've been absent and isn't going to pretend they weren't. I know, she said simply. I wasn't ready. And now, Eleanor looked around the room, at the families coming through the door, at the volunteers directing traffic, at the stacked supply crates, that 63 riders had carried in from 63 bikes. She looked at all of it with the expression of someone standing in a place they built years later, recognizing what survived. "Now I'm here," she said. The two words landed like something definitive. Pamela pressed her lips together briefly. The expression of a woman who has been doing this work long enough to know that people come back when they're ready and not a moment before, and the only right thing to do is be there when they arrive. "Come find me before you leave," she told Eleanor. "I have something for you from the files." Eleanor's expression shifted just slightly, just for a second, into something that looked like apprehension. "What kind of something?" "Good news," Pamela said. And she walked away because she had a meal program starting in 43 minutes and a full facility to prepare. Jake watched Eleanor watch her go. "What's in the files?" he asked. "I don't know," Eleanor said, "but you have a guess." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas kept records. When we were running things together, he kept records of everything. Donor contacts, volunteer hours, supply inventories. When we stepped back, I assumed they'd been transferred to the new administration or—" She stopped. "I don't know. I never asked." "You never came back to ask," Jake said. "Not an accusation, just the fact of it." "No," she agreed. "I never came back." She looked toward where Pamela had disappeared into the back hallway. "We built something here, and then we walked away from it, and then Thomas died, and then—" Her voice was even completely controlled, which Jake was starting to understand was not the absence of feeling, but its discipline. "Then it felt like coming back would be— I didn't know what it would feel like. I wasn't sure I wanted to find out." "But today you found out," Jake said. "Today," she said, "I found out." She squared her shoulders, that posture again, the straight spine of a woman who had been standing up through things for a very long time, and she walked toward the main room to help. Danny materialized at Jake's side with the regularity of someone who had decided sometime in the last 3 hours that proximity to Jake Reynolds was the place to be when important things were happening. "What was that about?" he asked. "She used to run this place," Jake said. Danny turned to look at where Eleanor had gone. "Of course she did," he said, in the tone of someone who has stopped being surprised and arrived at a kind of awed acceptance. "Of course." The unloading took 40 minutes. 63 people working in the organized rhythm of a group that had done this before, the supply crates moving from bikes to door to storage room in a human chain that was efficient and good-natured and punctuated by the particular brand of joking that people do when they're doing physical work together and everyone is in it equally. Eleanor worked the chain. Not directing it, she found a position in the middle and moved crates the same as everyone else. And when someone noticed and tried to suggest, "She might want to sit down," she said, "I'm fine, thank you," in a tone that communicated she was not going to have that conversation again. Jake was at the far end of the chain nearest the storage room door when Carla came and stood beside him with the expression of someone carrying information. "Found something out," Carla said quietly, setting down a crate. "Tell me." "I was talking to one of the long-term volunteers. Woman named Grace, been here 12 years. She knew Thomas." Carla paused. "She said Thomas used to come by after they stepped back from running things. Alone, usually Eleanor didn't come, but Thomas would stop in every few months, check on the supplies, see how things were going. Never made a big deal of it, just showed up." Jake thought about Thomas Whitmore pulling over on Route 9, just showing up, no fanfare. Grace said the last time he came was about 4 months before he died. She said he seemed tired, not sick, just tired in the way people get when they've been carrying something for a long time. She asked him how Eleanor was doing, and he said— Carla stopped. She picked up another crate to have something to do with her hands. "He said she was strong. He said she was stronger than she knew, and he only hoped she'd believe it someday." Jake set down the crate he was holding. He set it down very carefully. He knew, Jake said. Knew what? That he tried to find the right words, that she'd stopped, that she'd gotten to a place where she was going through the motions of being strong without believing it, and he was worried about what would happen when he was gone. Carla was quiet. "He was right to worry," Jake said. 6 years, Carla. 6 years of people telling her she was handling it beautifully. "While she was drowning," Carla said. She'd heard Eleanor say that word earlier, drowning, and it had clearly landed. While she was drowning. They stood together for a moment in the charged quiet of that. Then Danny's voice came from the middle of the chain, pitched to carry Hawk. "Hawk, come here." The tone was wrong again, the same wrong tone as when he'd picked up the photograph on the street in Millhaven. Jake was learning to read that tone. It meant Danny had encountered something he couldn't categorize and needed someone with more context. He moved through the chain to where Danny was standing near the front of the supply room beside a crate that was different from the others. Not one of the convoy's crates. An older crate, wooden, the kind with metal corner braces that people stopped using about 20 years ago when plastic containers took over everything. Danny was looking at the label on the side. Jake looked at the label. The label read in handwriting he recognized: W. Annual Supply Reserve. Do not relocate. W. For Whitmore. Grace found it, Danny said. She said it's been here since she doesn't know when, since before she started. It's been in the back corner of the storage room for at least 12 years, and nobody touched it because it said do not relocate. He paused. It's not locked. Jake looked at it for a long moment. Get Eleanor, he said. Danny went. Grace, the long-term volunteer, appeared at Jake's elbow. A woman in her 60s with capable hands and the expression of someone who has been waiting to have this conversation. I should have contacted the family years ago, she said. It said, do not relocate, and it didn't seem like anything that needed urgent attention. And then time. It's okay, Jake said. Is it? I don't know yet, he said honestly. Eleanor came through the supply room door with Danny 2 steps behind her. She saw the crate, immediately saw the label, saw the handwriting. Jake watched her face. What happened there was not dramatic. It was quiet and interior, and more difficult to witness for being so, because the things that moved across Eleanor Whitmore's face in that moment were things she clearly did not intend an audience for and was only barely aware she was showing. Recognition, and beneath that, the particular pain of being surprised by something you should have been prepared for but weren't. Because grief doesn't follow logic, and the handwriting of the dead lands differently every time you see it, no matter how many years have passed. She crossed the room. She crouched beside the crate. She put her hand on the label on the letters and held it there. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then she straightened up and her face was composed again, and she said, open it. Grace produced a pry bar from somewhere with the efficiency of a person who runs a resource center and always knows where the pry bar is. Jake worked the lid. Inside the crate was not a mystery. It was not a revelation in the dramatic sense. It was not gold or documents or anything that would look significant to a stranger's eye. It was supplies. Carefully organized, carefully sealed, dated, and categorized in Thomas Whitmore's handwriting: medical basics, non-perishable staples, batteries, emergency blankets, the kind of supplies that a family resource center needs when crisis arrives unannounced and the regular donation cycle hasn't caught up. Enough for 2 weeks of emergency operation, all of it still good, properly sealed, properly stored, the dates on the sealed items pushed out to 5 and 7 years. Thomas had packed it to last. Eleanor looked at the contents without speaking for a long time. Then she said, he packed this before his heart attack. How do you know? Jake asked. Because that's his emergency system, she said. He reorganized it every January, always in January. He'd have packed this in January and he died in April. She paused. I never knew he was doing this. I never knew this was here. Her voice did not break. It would not break. But it thinned slightly the way a river thins over stones, and the current was audible beneath it. He never told me. He packed it for the center, Jake said. He packed it for those people who came here, she corrected. He packed it for the family that shows up at 3 in the morning with nothing. He packed it for the situation that doesn't wait for the donation truck. She looked at the crate. He was always packing things for situations that don't wait. Grace, who had been standing quietly, said softly, he was here 4 months before he passed us in. He was in this room. He must have checked it, Eleanor said. He would have checked it and restocked anything that needed restocking and made sure the dates were good. She looked at Grace. Was he all right when he was here? Grace remembered what he'd told Carla. She remembered saying tired. She looked at Eleanor's face, the controlled, disciplined face of a woman asking a question she has needed to ask for 6 years, and she made a decision. He seemed like a man who was wrapping things up, Grace said carefully. Not in a frightening way, more like someone who was satisfied. Like someone who looked around and said, this is good, this is how it should be, I can leave this now. The sound Eleanor made was very small and might have been many things. A breath released, a thought completing. Something coming to rest. He knew, she said, not to anyone in particular. To Thomas, probably wherever Thomas had gone. You knew. Jake looked away to give her a moment and found himself looking at Danny, who was very carefully examining the wall with the focused attention of a young man who is feeling too many things and has decided that looking at the wall is safer than showing them. Carla had come into the supply room at some point. She stood near the door. She was doing the same thing Danny was doing with the wall. Jake looked back at Eleanor. She had straightened up again. She was looking at the crate with an expression that was different, now still complex, still carrying more than any single word could hold, but different. Less like being ambushed by grief and more like being found by something you'd been missing. What do you want to do with it? Jake asked. What Thomas put it here to do, she said. Use it. She looked at Grace. Is there a current need, specific families? Grace blinked, then shifted into the mode of a person whose job is to assess and respond to needs, the mode she'd probably been in so often. It was her default setting. We have 3 families in acute shortage right now. Medical supplies for 1, food basics for 2. And we've had a surge in emergency walk-ins since the industrial closure on Route 44. So, show me the intake forms, Eleanor said. Grace went to show her. Danny turned from the wall. His face was doing the thing young faces do when a feeling has gotten bigger than the available space, the particular compression of someone trying to manage more emotion than they budgeted for. She came here carrying 2 envelopes, he said to Jake. She didn't know about the crate. No, Jake agreed. She thought she was coming to do 1 thing, and she ended up doing 6 things, and none of them were the things she thought she was doing. That's generally how it works, Jake said. When she finds out what's in those files that Pamela mentioned. Danny stopped. There's going to be more, isn't there? There's going to be something else. Jake thought about Thomas Whitmore, about a man who packed emergency crates and wrote letters to strangers and built charity rides and maintained them from a distance and stopped for people on dark roads and sat with them in the dirt and stayed until help arrived. A man who did things in layers in advance in the quiet without announcement. Yeah, Jake said, I think there's going to be something else. He was right. Pamela found them 20 minutes later, Jake and Eleanor standing in the hallway between the supply room and the main facility. Eleanor with a cup of coffee that Grace had pressed into her hands and was now cooling in her grip because she hadn't drunk any of it. Pamela was carrying a folder. It was not a thin folder. This was in the administrative archive, Pamela said. She handed it to Eleanor. It was filed under founding documents. I found it when I took over the directorship and I didn't know what to do with it because the contact information was 16 years out of date. And I kept meaning to track you down and never did. Life. She made the gesture people make for life, the small, helpless motion of the hands. I'm sorry it took this long. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside was a document. Several pages clearly, a legal document of some kind with the particular density of language that lawyers produce when they are being very precise about something. Eleanor read the first page. She went very still. Jake was watching her face. He saw the moment the words reached her, saw something happen behind her eyes that was seismic internal. The kind of event that rearranges things without showing it on the surface, except in the very small ways that you only see if you are watching closely. Eleanor, he said quietly. She held out the document without speaking. He took it. It was a deed of endowment, signed 16 years ago, notarized, filed with the county recorder's office. It established a permanent fund, not large, not a wealthy person's large, but meaningful. The kind of fund that a working man and woman build by contributing steadily over years and decades to support the operational continuity of the Millhaven Family Resource Center in perpetuity. The fund was named the Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore Continuity Fund, both names, not just Thomas's name. Both names. Jake read the document a second time to make sure he was reading it correctly because his eyes had started doing the thing where they moved too fast for accuracy, and he wanted to be accurate. He was reading it correctly. He put your name on it, Jake said. Eleanor said nothing. He filed this 16 years ago, years before he died. He put your name on it, both of you. I never signed anything, Eleanor said. Her voice was very quiet. I never signed a document like this. There's a signature page, Jake said. He turned to the back of the document and held it out to her. She looked at it. There was her name, her signature. Her handwriting unmistakably, she would know her own handwriting on anything. Eleanor Marie Whitmore, in ink, with a date 16 years old. She stared at it. I signed this, she said. Yes. I don't remember signing this. Jake looked at the date again, looked at the document header. Did you sign anything around this time? Any papers, legal, administrative? We were filing for the Sanders nonprofit reclassification that year, she said slowly. Thomas brought home a packet of papers. I signed it where he told me to sign. I didn't read all of... She stopped. I didn't read all of them. The silence that followed had a shape to it. Thomas Whitmore had submitted documents for the center's reclassification and included this endowment document in the packet, and Eleanor had signed where he told her to sign without reading the specific document that put her name permanently on a fund that would support the place they built together. Not deception, not manipulation. She could see that. She could see exactly what it was. A man who knew his wife well enough to know that if he asked her to sign her name to something, she would think it was modest. She would think it was small. She would deflect and minimize and say, no, Thomas, this should just be your name. So he hadn't asked. He'd simply made it true. He put my name on it, she said again. But it was different this time. The first time was surprise. The second time was something that didn't have a clean name, something between being known and being claimed, and being remembered in a way that didn't require you to be the widow. Just Eleanor. Eleanor Marie Whitmore, co-founder, co-benefactor. Name on a legal document, present tense. Even now, 6 years after Thomas was gone, still present tense. He wouldn't let me disappear, she said. Her voice had done something, Sharon, then cracked almost just at the edge, just for a syllable before she pulled it back to level. Pamela, who had been standing quietly during all of this, said, the fund has been active the whole time. Quarterly disbursements. We've received... She looked at a note clipped inside the folder. 16 years of disbursements, every one. It's helped us stay open twice when our main funding came up short. She paused. I didn't know who to thank. I've been wanting to thank someone for 16 years. Eleanor looked at Pamela. And then for the first time since the morning began, since the street in Millhaven, since the photograph hit the pavement, since Jake Reynolds had said, your husband saved my life, Eleanor Whitmore's composure broke. Not catastrophically, not in the way of collapse, in the way of something that has been held very tightly for a very long time, finally being allowed to move. Her eyes filled. She didn't wipe them immediately. She let it happen, let the feeling be visible for the 3 or 4 seconds it needed to be visible, which was all she was going to give it because she was Eleanor Whitmore, and she was going to keep standing whether her eyes were wet or not. Tell me what you need, she said to Pamela. Her voice was rough but steady. Right now, today. What does this place need that it doesn't have? Pamela blinked. Eleanor. Tell me what you need, Eleanor said again. The same 3 words Thomas had used on Route 9. What do you need? Handed down across decades from a man who learned that question mattered and had lived it until it was bone deep. I have time. I don't have much else on my calendar today. Pamela looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, come to my office. And Eleanor went. Jake watched them disappear down the hallway, and then he stood in the hallway alone for a moment, the folder still in his hand. Thomas Whitmore's letter in his chest pocket, the photograph of Route 9 that Eleanor had taken back, but that was imprinted somewhere behind his eyes now. All of it, the whole extraordinary accumulation of this morning. Fender came around the corner from the main room. We're about wrapped up, he said. The meal program is setting up and Pamela wants us clear in 15. He looked at Jake's face. You look like you've been hit by something. I feel like it, Jake said. Good hit or bad hit? The kind that comes from finding out the ground you've been standing on is deeper than you knew. Fender considered this. He was not a man who needed everything explained. He'd been running a chapter for 11 years and had learned to read between the lines of what Jake said. The woman, he said, all of it, Jake said. Her husband, this place, the fund, the letter Fender. He wrote me a letter. He wrote it in his last year and she carried it for 6 years and she brought it this morning. Fender was quiet. He put her name on a fund they built together, Jake continued, and she didn't know. She signed the document without reading it, and he let her, and then he died, and she spent 6 years thinking she'd step back from everything they'd built, and she didn't know her name was still on it. But now she knows, Fender said. Now she knows. Fender looked down the hallway where Eleanor had gone. She okay? Better than okay, Jake said. I think she's... He searched for it. I think she just remembered who she is. Fender made a sound that was not quite words. The sound of a big man who works hard to maintain a hard-bitten exterior, having a difficult time maintaining it. 15 minutes, he said, or Pamela will have my head. He walked back to the main room. Danny came from the other direction, which was getting to be such a consistent pattern that Jake almost said something about it. Danny had information on his face the way he always did. It wasn't subtlety's strong suit at 26. Marcus is here, Danny said. Jake stopped. What? Parking lot. He drove up about 3 minutes ago. Big silver pickup Tennessee plates. Danny paused. He said you'd know who he was. Jake walked to the parking lot. Marcus Webb was standing beside his truck with the particular stance of a man who has driven somewhere quickly and is now trying to look like he wasn't in a hurry. He was 62, lean in the way of men who stay physical past 50, with close-cut gray hair and the face of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life outdoors. He and Jake had known each other since before either of them had gray hair, which was long enough that the friendship had stopped being a choice and become a fixture, the kind of relationship that operates more like weather than decision. You drove down, Jake said. You called and told me Thomas Whitmore's wife was here, Marcus said. Where else was I going to be? I didn't ask you to drive down. No, you never asked for anything, which is a flaw in your character that Thomas probably noticed too, by the way. Marcus looked at the resource center. She inside with Pamela, the director. How is she, Bahan? Jake thought about Eleanor's eyes filling and not being wiped away. I think she just remembered who she is. She's getting there, he said. She found some things this morning that she didn't expect to find. Marcus nodded slowly. About Thomas. About herself, mostly. Thomas was just the one who kept leaving her breadcrumbs. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, the photograph, the one I apparently took and don't remember taking, she had it. 40 years. Marcus let out a long breath. You know the reason I was on Route 9 that night. Jake looked at him. I was coming to find you, Marcus said. You'd been riding for 4 hours and I knew what state you were in when you left and I drove out to find you. I didn't tell you that then because you would have said you didn't need looking after. I didn't need looking after, Jake said automatically. You absolutely needed looking after, Marcus said. And Thomas Whitmore found you before I did and did a better job of it than I would have, frankly, because he was a stranger and strangers can sometimes do what friends can't. He paused. I got there and you were loading the bike and this man was, I took one photo, I don't even know why, just something told me to, and then his truck was already pulling away. He stopped. I spent a long time feeling guilty that he got there first, that he was the one who, Marcus, I know it's not rational. He was supposed to get there first, Jake said, the same way she was supposed to show up this morning, the same way you drove down here today. He looked at his old friend. Some things wait for the right moment. Thomas knew that. She knows that. He paused. You knew it too. You just drove 3 hours because of it. Marcus was quiet. Then he said, I want to meet her. She'll be out in a few minutes. Good. He leaned against his truck. Danny said she navigated the alternate route. She maintained it for 4 years without telling anyone, in case it was needed. Marcus stared at him. She what? You heard me. Marcus stared a second longer. Then he said slowly and with genuine feeling, Thomas Whitmore, you did not deserve that woman. And you knew it, and you spent 43 years trying to anyway. Jake felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the morning started. Not all the way loose, not fully resolved, but something. The particular release of a truth being said out loud by the right person. Yeah, he said, I think that's probably accurate. The resource center door opened. Eleanor came out. She didn't look like someone who had cried, which was an achievement. She looked like someone who had been through something and come through it. There's a difference and it's visible if you know how to look. She moved with the same straight spine steadiness she'd had all morning, but there was something less defended about it now. Less careful, as though she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally been able to set it down in a safe place. She saw Marcus. She slowed. Marcus Webb, Jake said. He was on Route 9 that night. He took the photograph. Eleanor looked at Marcus for a moment. Marcus looked back at her. He had the expression of a man who has been carrying his own weight about this for 38 years. I should have gotten there sooner, he said. I should have. Stop, Eleanor said, not unkindly. The way you stop someone who is walking toward a ledge they don't need to walk toward. Thomas found him. Jake found his way. You drove 3 hours today. She paused. That's enough. That's more than enough. Marcus swallowed. He kept the photograph, Eleanor said. He kept it 40 years. That means whatever you captured in that moment was something worth preserving. She looked at Marcus steadily. Thank you for being there, even if you were 3 hours late. Marcus made a sound that was not words. Jake had known Marcus for 40 years and had heard that sound exactly 3 times. Carla appeared at the center door and spoke from behind Eleanor. Hey, Hawk, Fender says we're moving in 5. She looked at the three of them standing in the parking lot and read the room with the speed of a woman who had been riding sweep for 6 years and had learned to assess situations quickly. Everything okay? Yeah, Jake said. You sure? We're sure, Eleanor said. Carla looked at her, then at Jake. Then she said, all right, and went back inside. Danny came out 2 minutes later and stopped at the sight of Marcus and gave Jake a look that said, who is this and what does it mean? And Jake gave him a look back that said later. And Danny accepted this with the equanimity of someone who has learned that the story is still going and the full meaning will arrive on its own schedule. Because it would, because the morning was not finished. Because Eleanor Whitmore was standing in a parking lot with 2 people who had been connected to her husband without knowing it, and behind her was a building. Her name was on that she hadn't known she still owned a piece of, and ahead of her was 47 miles back to Millhaven, the same route they'd taken to get here minus the detours, and Jake had been thinking since the words, what do you need, had come out of Eleanor's mouth in Pamela's hallway about something he hadn't yet said, something that needed to be said before they rode back. Something that had started forming in the back of his mind when Carla said she's something else in the veterans' home and had been building since. Eleanor, Jake said, she turned. He'd been thinking about how to say this for 20 minutes and had not improved on the direct version, which was the version he almost always ended up using anyway. When we get back, he said, I want you to come to the chapter meeting. She blinked. I'm not as a member, he said quickly before she could object to the wrong thing. As a founder. As someone with history that we should know and don't. He paused. We've been running Thomas's ride for 22 years without knowing Thomas started it. We've been funded partly by a Whitmore endowment without knowing Eleanor Whitmore was alive and 8 blocks away. He looked at her. That's wrong. That's something that got dropped and it shouldn't have been dropped, and I want to fix it. She was quiet. You don't have to do anything, Jake continued. You don't have to take on a role or a responsibility. You just have to come and let us know you. He paused. And let us tell you who we became, because some of what we became, more than I knew this morning, we became because of you and Thomas. Marcus was watching this with the expression of someone witnessing something they want to remember accurately. Eleanor looked at Jake for a long moment. All right, she said. Just that. The same 2 words she'd said when he offered her the pillion seat. All right, simple acceptance, no fanfare, the decision made and stated and done. But her eyes were different. There was something in them that hadn't been there when she'd walked up to him on the street in Millhaven and asked her quiet, courageous question. Not relief, she'd been brave enough for that not to be the word. Not triumph, she'd never wanted that. Something closer to arrival. The feeling of having come a long way and recognized the destination. All right, Jake agreed. And the 5 of them, Jake, Eleanor, Marcus, Danny, Carla, who had come back out without anyone noticing, stood in the parking lot of the Millhaven Family Resource Center on a Tuesday morning in October, connected by a photograph, in a letter, in a crumpled envelope, in a road that Thomas Whitmore had once maintained and Eleanor had quietly kept alive. And for a moment, none of them moved or spoke, because sometimes the right response to a moment is just to be fully in it before it changes. Then Fender's voice came through Jake's earpiece. Hawk, we rolling or what? Jake touched the mic. We're rolling. He looked at Eleanor. She was already moving toward the bike. The convoy pulled out of the resource center parking lot at 9:22, and the formation that reassembled itself on the road back toward Millhaven was subtly different from the one that had left Main and Cedar that morning. Not in number 63 bikes, same as before. Not in order, Fender still up front, Carla still running sweep. But different in the way that groups of people are different after something real has happened to them together, even if most of them couldn't have said exactly what that something was. Word had moved. It always moved. 63 people in close quarters for 3 hours working together, waiting together, navigating 2 detours on trust. And somewhere in that time, the story of Eleanor Whitmore had filtered from front to back and side to side the way water finds its way through any available space. Not all the details, Not the letter or the endowment or Thomas's name on the first ride banner. But enough. The photograph, Jake's story, the alternate route she'd known about for 4 years. The woman on the pillion who'd been there before either Jake or Fender or anyone currently riding had arrived. The mood in the formation was different, quieter, more attentive. The way people get when they're trying to process something that has more layers than they expected. Eleanor felt it. She didn't mention it. She wasn't the kind of woman who mentioned such things, but Jake felt her awareness of it through the subtle adjustments of her posture. The way someone holds themselves when they know they're being regarded and have decided to be comfortable with that fact rather than managed by it. Marcus was running his truck alongside the convoy's flank, which was unorthodox, but which Fender had approved with the pragmatic logic of a chapter president who had just watched a civilian woman navigate 2 emergency detours and was therefore disinclined to be picky about convoy etiquette. They were 12 minutes into the return when Eleanor said something. She'd said very little since they'd mounted up a thank you to Danny, who'd helped recheck the helmet strap. A brief exchange with Carla about the weather moving in from the west, which both of them had noted with the matter-of-fact attention of people who pay attention to weather, because weather is something that matters. But 12 minutes in, she leaned forward slightly and spoke directly to the back of Jake's helmet. "I want to stop somewhere," she said, "on the way back." Jake tapped the mic to hold comms, and then because he needed to hear her clearly, "Where Route 9, she said, "the stretch where Thomas stopped for you." Jake's hands stayed steady on the grips. "You know where it is?" he asked. "Thomas described it," she said. "The mile marker, the curve, the way the tree line breaks on the east side. I've driven past it." A pause. "I've never stopped." Jake thought about this for a moment. About the implications of stopping, of pulling 63 bikes over on a 2-lane highway for a reason that wasn't mechanical. About what that stop would mean and whether he had any business deciding it for 63 other people. He keyed the mic. "Fender. Go ahead. Need a 5-minute stop on Route 9 before we get back. Personal." The word personal in Jake's vocabulary meant something specific. It meant non-negotiable, and it meant the reason would be given later, and it meant anyone who had ridden with Jake Reynolds for more than 6 months already understood that personal stops were granted without argument. Fender said, "Copy, your lead." Jake pressed the throttle a half degree. "Tell me when you recognize it," Ronnie told Eleanor. "I'll know it," she said. She did. 14 miles out from Millhaven. She put one hand briefly on Jake's shoulder, not gripping, just a touch, the kind of directional signal you give to a driver without words. And he eased right onto the shoulder, smooth and gradual, and the formation ratted and followed 63 bikes drifting right in sequence and coming to rest with the patient inevitability of something that has done this 10,000 times. The engines idled down, then quieted. All of them in the space of about 90 seconds, 63 engines going to silence on the shoulder of Route 9, because one woman had put her hand on Jake Reynolds' shoulder, and that was apparently enough. Eleanor dismounted. She didn't say anything. She walked to the edge of the road, shoulder to the place where the pavement ended and the dirt began, and she stood there and she looked at the road. Jake dismounted and stood behind her, not close far enough to give her space, near enough to be present. The rest of the convoy stayed on their bikes. Nobody got off. Nobody spoke. Not Fender, not Danny, not Carla, not any of the 59 other people who had no complete understanding of why they were stopped here, but who understood with the instinctive social intelligence of people who ride together that something was happening that required stillness. Marcus parked the truck on the far edge of the shoulder and did not get out. Eleanor stood at the roadside for a long time, not crying, not speaking, just standing. The way you stand in a place that is important and you've never been to before, and you're trying to understand how the air feels in it, how the ground feels under your feet, what the place has to say for itself. Finally, she said, still facing the road, "What time of night was it?" "About 11, Jake said, a little after." "Was it raining yet?" "Not yet. Storm was building." "He would have had his high beams on," she said. "Thomas always drove with his high beams on secondary roads at night. He said you can't help what you don't see." A pause. "He would have seen you from a quarter mile out." Jake said nothing. Let her have the silence she needed. "He saw you and he pulled over," she said. "That was always Thomas. He didn't deliberate about things like that. He'd pull over and then figure out the rest after." She paused. "I used to say it was going to get him into trouble someday. Hey, stopping for strangers on empty roads. She stopped. It never did. No, Jake said quietly. It never did. She turned around. Her face was fully composed, eyes clear. Whatever interior work she'd needed to do at the side of that road, she'd done it. Thank you for stopping, she said. To Jake, but also somehow to the road, to the 63 idling bikes behind them, to Thomas, to whoever or whatever was listening. Thank you for asking, Jake said. Same words he'd used about the ride, same meaning. She looked at him. He would have liked you, she said. Very much. He had a way of knowing people in the first 5 minutes. He'd come home after meeting someone and say, that's a good one, and he was almost never wrong. She paused. He would have said that about you. Jake felt the words go into him and settle. He didn't try to respond to them. Some things don't need a response. Some things just need to be received the way Thomas had received a 23-year-old in the dirt on a dark road, not with commentary, not with framing, just with presence. He received it. Then he said, we should get back on the road. Yes, Eleanor agreed. We should. They mounted up. The engine started. 63 bikes back to life in sequence, the sound rising like something breathing, and the convoy pulled back onto Route 9 and moved. But something was different in the formation now. Something had clarified. The quiet understanding that had been building all morning through the photograph on the street, through the veterans' home, through the resource center, through the folder in Pamela's hands, had solidified into something more solid. Something the convoy was now carrying together rather than observing individually. Danny pulled up alongside Jake at the first long straight close enough to talk across the lane, which was technically against the formation rules and which Jake was not going to say anything about. Is she okay? Danny asked. She's excellent, Jake said. Danny processed this. That was Route 9. Yes. Where Thomas stopped for you. Yes. And she'd never been there. No. Danny rode beside him for a moment, the two bikes tracking, parallel, the kind of synchronized movement that happens naturally between riders who've spent time together. Hawk, Danny said, when we get back to Millhaven, what happens? What do you mean what happens? I mean with her, with Eleanor. It's not just a chapter meeting, is it? That's not enough. Jake looked at the road ahead. He'd been thinking about this since the resource center parking lot, since the moment Eleanor had said, all right, and he'd felt the weight of what that simple agreement actually meant. Not just a meeting, not just an acknowledgement of history, something more. But he hadn't said it yet because he hadn't found the right form for it. Not just a meeting, he agreed. Then what? I'm working on it. Danny nodded, accepting this, and fell back into formation. Jake worked on it. The answer started taking shape somewhere between mile 20 and mile 30, which was the stretch of road that ran through the back edge of the county farmland, where the terrain opened up and the sky got bigger and the road got straight and there was nothing to do but ride and think. What had happened this morning was not accidental. Not in the sense of random, it was accidental in the sense of unplanned, yes. But underneath the unplanned surface was something that had been building for a very long time. Thomas Whitmore had built it, and Eleanor had maintained it, and Jake had been living inside it without knowing it, and now they all knew. And what do you do with knowing you don't put it back in the envelope? The chapter house in Millhaven was a converted auto shop on the east end of Cedar Street that the chapter had owned for 19 years. It had a main floor and a back room and a large parking area and walls that held 40 years of collective history and photographs and plaques, and the kind of accumulated objects that organizations keep because they represent something that shouldn't be forgotten. What it did not have, Jake realized, was Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore. Anywhere. Not in the photographs, not in the plaques, not in the founding documents that hung in the back room in a frame that had been there since before Jake arrived. Not in any of the written history of the charity ride that the chapter maintained with the particular combination of pride and informality that defined how they held their own story. Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore had built the first version of this ride, had funded it through a legal endowment that was still active, had handed it off with the quiet generosity of people who believe the thing matters more than the credit, and the chapter had taken it forward without knowing any of that because nobody had told them and they hadn't known to ask. That was going to change. Not in a ceremony. Eleanor would hate a ceremony. He was certain of that with the confidence of a man who has spent a morning learning to read someone accurately. Not in a formal recognition event with speeches and plaques in the performative gratitude that well-meaning organizations produce when they want to honor someone. Something different. something she would actually want. I thought about what she'd said in the resource center. I came here for me. He thought about what she'd said to Pamela. Tell me what you need. He thought about the way she'd sat with Earl in the veterans' home asking follow-up questions that proved she was listening. About the way she'd sat with the woman with the unread book. About the way she'd crouched down to talk to the 4-year-old in the parking lot. She didn't want recognition. She wanted to be useful. Those were very different things. He keyed the mic. Fender, chapter meeting tonight, emergency session, a beat of silence. What's the agenda? Future of the ride, Jake said, and some history we've been missing. Another beat. That's a lot to cover in one session. We've got the time, Jake said, and Eleanor Whitmore. He heard Fender absorb this. Heard the pause that meant the chapter president was calculating not logistics, but meaning what it would mean to have Eleanor Whitmore in the chapter house, what it would mean to finally put the right name to the right history, what it would mean for the chapter going forward. 7 o'clock, Fender said. I'll get the word out. Thank you. He looked ahead at the road. The outskirts of Millhaven were beginning to appear at the edges of the county farmland, the first subdivisions, the water tower, the cellular antenna on the hill that meant you were less than 5 miles out. He said over his shoulder, chapter's meeting tonight, 7 o'clock. Will you come? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. What's the meeting about? She asked. The ride, Jake said. Its future, and the part of its past that we finally know about. She was quiet again. Longer this time. I'm not a joiner, she said finally. Thomas was the one who could walk into a room and be comfortable. I'm better with people one at a time. I know, Jake said. This isn't about joining. It's about being heard. He paused. You've been invisible to us for 20 years by accident. You deserve to not be invisible anymore, even if it's only for one night. She said nothing. Also, Jake added, we have a problem. She picked up on the shift in his tone immediately. What kind of problem? The ride has always ended at the start point. We debrief on the street where we launch its tradition. There are usually some townspeople who come out to hear how it went. This year, there are some things that happened today that the town probably should know about. He paused. Specifically, they should know that the alternate route that saved this morning's run was maintained by a woman named Eleanor Whitmore, who also happens to be one of the people who built this ride in the first place. Jake, I'm not going to let you be modest about this, he said with the same quiet finality he used when he said things the second time. You can decide how much you want to say, but you're going to be present when it's said. She made a sound, not agreement, not quite more, the sound of someone who has been presented with a decision and is deciding whether to fight it. She didn't fight it. All right, she said, for the third time that morning. 3 times she'd said those 2 words. Each time with the same small weight, the same steady acceptance. Each time meaning something slightly different. The pillion seat, the chapter meeting, and now this. Standing at the end of the ride and letting people know she'd been there. Jake kept his eyes on the road and didn't let any of what he was feeling reach his face because he was driving 60 miles per hour in a convoy, and that required his full professional attention. But something in his chest was doing a thing that it hadn't done in a very long time. Something warm and certain, and there was no better word for it, right? The Millhaven town center came into view, and what met them there was not what any of them had expected. The street at Main and Cedar, the launch point where the Lions Club table had stood that morning, where the crowd had gathered to watch them roll out, was full. Not the modest Tuesday morning crowd from 7 hours earlier. Not the respectful scattering of early risers and coffee drinkers who'd come to watch the bikes line up. Full. People on both sidewalks. Families, older couples, the barbers from the shop on the corner. People Jake recognized and people he didn't. Someone had set up a proper speaker system that was playing nothing right now, but clearly had the capacity for something. The Lions Club table was back restocked and had been joined by 2 other tables that Jake didn't recognize. Fender came on the mic. You seeing this? I'm seeing it, Jake said. Did you know about this? No. Did anybody know about this? Nobody answered, which was itself the answer. The convoy made its final approach on Cedar, and the crowd on the sidewalks did something that made Danny Reeves, watching from Jake's mirror, grab his hand grip a little tighter. They applauded. Not the polite applause of an organized event. The real kind, spontaneous building from one side of the street to the other. The sound of people who'd heard something during the morning through the particular small-town osmosis of a community that still functioned as one through phone calls, through the family members of riders who'd been texting updates through the resource center staff, who'd called somebody else, and had come out because they wanted to be here when it ended. Eleanor went very still on the pillion. Jake felt it, the tension change in her posture, not fear but the sudden awareness of being seen on a scale she hadn't prepared for. "It's for all of us," Jake said, "not just you." "I know," she said, but her voice was different. He pulled to a stop at the front of the formation in the space that had been left clear for the lead bike, and he killed the engine and put down the kickstand and got off, and he turned to offer Eleanor his hand for dismounting. She took it. Not because she needed it, she'd mounted and dismounted twice today without assistance. But she took it and stepped off the bike and stood beside him on Main Street in Millhaven, while 63 bikes came to rest behind them. The applause was sustained. Danny pulled up 2 bikes back and got off and stood there with the expression of a young man who was trying very hard not to look as moved as he is. Carla was somewhere behind him doing a significantly better job of the same thing, which made sense, because Carla had 20 more years of practice. Fender pulled his own bike to the front and dismounted and stood on Jake's other side, and the 3 of them, 4 with Eleanor, faced the town that had come out to meet them. A woman pushed forward from the crowd. Early 60s purposeful, the kind of purposeful that meant she had something specific to say and had been waiting to say it. Jake didn't know her name, but he recognized her face. She came to the departure every year and had for as long as he'd been doing this. She looked at Eleanor. "You're Eleanor Whitmore," the woman said. Not a question. Eleanor said yes. "My mother lives at the Hargrove County Veterans Home," the woman said. "She's 91. She doesn't talk much anymore. She talked to you today." Eleanor blinked. The woman with the unread book. Late 80s Jake had thought, but he'd been wrong by a few years. "She called me," the woman said, "after you left. She called me and she talked for 20 minutes. Her voice did something at the edges that she controlled quickly with the efficiency of a woman who'd been managing the particular grief of a parent's decline and had learned to handle it in public. "She hasn't called me on her own in 8 months. Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. The woman reached out and put her hand briefly on Eleanor's arm. One touch quick, the touch of someone expressing something they don't have adequate words for, and then stepped back into the crowd. Jake looked at Eleanor. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were very bright. She looked like a woman who is holding something together with the entire force of her considerable will and is going to keep holding it together, and the only concession she's going to make to the magnitude of the moment is to be completely still. Pamela appeared at the edge of the crowd. She'd driven back from the resource center, or maybe she'd never left. Jake wasn't sure, with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who has witnessed something they intended to witness. And then someone else pushed forward. Jake saw him before Eleanor did. An older man, mid-80s, military posture. That age hadn't fully taken the particular bearing of someone who spent years standing at attention and never entirely stopped. He was holding a small folded flag, the kind that comes in a triangle case, but this one was just folded, not cased, held in both hands. He stopped in front of Eleanor. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas Whitmore built the first run, 1989. I was there. I was the first veteran who got out of that building," and shook his hand when the bikes pulled in. His voice had the quality of old wood, solid weathered, carrying its age with a kind of dignity. "I've been waiting for 20 years to thank a Whitmore in person." Eleanor pressed her lips together. The man held out the folded flag. "This was from my wife's funeral," he said, "last year. She always said that the people who show up without being asked are the ones who matter." She meant Thomas. She meant you. He paused. "I want you to have it, because you showed up today, because you still showed up." Eleanor took the flag. She held it in both hands, and this time she did not hold herself together. Not catastrophically. Eleanor Whitmore was not going to be catastrophic in the middle of Main Street in Millhaven. That was simply not who she was. But the tears came real ones, and she let them, and she stood there on the street with a folded flag and wet eyes and 63 riders behind her in a town in front of her. And she didn't try to manage any of it. She just let herself be in it. Jake stood beside her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Danny Reeves, two bikes back, turned and looked directly at the sky with the focused intensity of someone examining cloud formations. Fender cleared his throat. Carla walked forward, came up beside Eleanor, and without asking or announcing, simply put her hand on Eleanor's back. Not patting, not directing, just there. The way women sometimes know how to be present for each other that men spend lifetimes trying to learn. Eleanor pulled herself together in about 30 seconds. She wiped her eyes once precisely with the back of her wrist. She looked at the older veteran who had been waiting with the patience of a man who'd spent decades standing at ease. "What was her name?" Eleanor asked. "Ruth," he said. "Tell me about Ruth," Eleanor said. And then she did the thing she'd been doing all morning. She leaned forward and she listened right there on the sidewalk on Main Street, while the convoy stood behind her and the town stood around her. She just listened to an old man tell her about his wife. Jake stepped back a half step to give her room. Marcus appeared at his elbow. He'd parked the truck on a side street and walked over, and he'd clearly arrived in time to see the flag, and he had the face of a man who has made a quiet, private decision. "I need to say something to her," Marcus said, "tonight, at the chapter meeting." "You're coming to the chapter meeting?" Jake asked. "You're going to tell me I can't?" "You can come to the chapter meeting." Marcus nodded. "I have something to say. About Route 9. About Thomas. About—" He stopped. "I've been carrying something since that night, and I've been carrying it wrong, feeling guilty for arriving late when I should have been." He searched for it. "I should have been grateful. Grateful I arrived at all. Grateful Thomas got there first. Grateful that the thing that needed to happen, happened." He looked at Eleanor, who was still deep in conversation with the veteran, who had apparently been holding 30 years of Ruth's stories and was now releasing them in a compressed and gratitude-fueled torrent. "She's the one who showed me that. Just now. Without meaning to." "She does that a lot," Jake said. "Thomas used to do that too," Marcus said. "Show you something without meaning to. Without making a speech about it." He paused. "He found the right person." "He did," Jake agreed. "She found the right people today." Jake looked around, at the town that had come out, at the riders who'd stayed. Nobody had left 63 people on 63 bikes still present, because the morning felt unfinished and everyone could feel it. At Danny examining cloud formations, and Carla steady beside Eleanor, and Fender talking to 3 townspeople who'd approached him with questions, and Pamela taking notes on her phone, which Jake was going to ask about later. He looked at all of it. "She found us," he said. "Or we found her. I'm not sure which way it runs." "Both ways," Marcus said. "Always both ways." The debrief that followed was not the usual debrief. The usual debrief was Fender at the front, numbers and logistics, how much was delivered and what was still needed, and what went wrong and what went right, and what they do differently next year. Clean, efficient, useful. The kind of debrief that working organizations run when they take themselves seriously. This year, Fender started the same way. The numbers were good, the delivery was complete, the detours had added 22 minutes to the total runtime, but the mission had been accomplished without cancellation or significant delay. And then he stopped. He looked at Eleanor, who was standing at the edge of the street with Carla on one side and the folded flag in her hands. "There's something else this year," Fender said. His voice carried the way it always did. Fender was a large man with a voice built for open spaces. The crowd quieted. "This morning we learned something about this ride that we should have known a long time ago. The first annual Millhaven Charity Run was organized in 1989 by a group of people that included Thomas Whitmore and his wife Eleanor." He let that sit. "Thomas Whitmore," Fender continued, "helped start something that we've been carrying forward for 22 years without knowing who built the foundation. He also helped fund it through a legal endowment that is still active, that has kept this organization running through some difficult years." He paused. "He died 6 years ago, but his name belongs on this ride, and we're going to make sure it's there." From the crowd, someone started clapping. Not a long applause, just a beat, 3 or 4 seconds, real and specific. The applause of people who are acknowledging a fact that should have been acknowledged a long time ago. Fender waited for it to end. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, "showed up this morning without a bike and without a helmet and asked for a ride. Jake Reynolds did the right thing and said yes." Another beat in the crowd. "She also knew an alternate route that saved this morning's mission when Meridian Bridge closed, and she knew it because she'd been maintaining it for 4 years. Without being asked, without telling anyone." He looked directly at Eleanor. "That's the kind of person this ride was built by, and the kind of person that makes it worth doing." Eleanor held very still under this. Her chin was up. Her expression was composed in the way of someone who has decided that if she must be seen, she is going to be seen standing straight. Fender said, "Eleanor, anything you want to say." She looked at him, then she looked at Jake. Jake gave her the smallest nod, not directing, just affirming. "You've got this. Say the thing." She looked at the crowd. She said, "Thomas would have told me I was making a fuss about nothing." A small, real laugh from people who had a feeling for what Thomas Whitmore might have sounded like. He would have said the ride matters, and the riders matter, and the people at the end of the ride matter, and the rest is just details. She paused. He was usually right about things like that. She looked at the flag in her hands. "I came here this morning for complicated reasons," she said. "I thought I was coming for him, and I was partly, but mostly I was coming because I'd been standing still for 6 years and I needed to move." She paused. "You moved with me today. All of you." She looked at the riders. "That's not nothing. That's not a detail." Silence. Then Danny Reeves, 26 years old, the youngest full-patch member of the chapter, the one who'd bent down to pick up the photograph and started everything that followed, started to clap. Not tentatively, not the polite, measured applause of someone taking social cues. The real kind, the loud kind, the kind that means something. It moved through the crowd in about 4 seconds. Jake crossed his arms over his chest and stood in it and let it happen because some things needed to happen. Eleanor accepted the applause the same way she accepted everything, with the patient dignity of a woman who'd lived long enough to know that what mattered was what you did, not what you received for doing it. But she was smiling, not the small, controlled expression she'd been wearing all morning. A real smile, wide and genuine and a little unsteady at the edges, the kind of smile that happens when something you didn't know you needed lands exactly right. She was 74 years old, and she was standing in the middle of Main Street in Millhaven, Tennessee, on a Tuesday in October, holding a dead man's flag and a living community's acknowledgement, and she was smiling. Thomas Whitmore, Jake thought, would have been watching from somewhere, and he would have been doing exactly what Marcus had said, not making a speech, not demanding credit, just watching the thing he'd built hold the weight of his wife's return. He would have been satisfied. He would have said, "That's the whole thing. Stop for someone, sit with them, ask what they need. That's the whole thing." Jake reached into his inner jacket pocket and touched Thomas's letter still folded there. And he thought about what it meant to carry something for a long time and finally know where to put it down, not to lose it, just to put it in the right place. I thought about the chapter meeting at 7 o'clock and what he was going to say in it, in the form that was starting to take in the back of his mind. Not a ceremony, not a plaque, something more alive than that. And he thought about Eleanor, who had asked for a ride on a morning when she needed to move forward and who had ended up moving something much larger than herself. The crowd was beginning to disperse the way crowds do when the main thing has happened and people feel the permission to go about their day. The riders were moving toward their bikes. The Lions Club was packing up tables. The veteran with Ruth's stories had shaken Eleanor's hand twice and was being gently walked back to his car by a younger man who was probably his son. Carla came to stand beside Jake. "Hell of a morning," she said. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "She said she came here because she needed to move. 6 years of standing still and she needed to move." Carla paused. "That's what we do. That's literally what we do. We move. That's the whole point. The ride moves, the supplies move, the money moves, everything moves forward." Jake looked at her. "She came to the right place," Carla said simply. "She built the right place," Jake said, "a long time ago." Carla nodded once. And Eleanor Whitmore, 20 feet away, was watching the last of the crowd disperse with the expression of a woman who has arrived somewhere she didn't know she was going and recognized it immediately as where she needed to be. The folded flag was pressed against her chest, the same way she'd held the envelopes that morning. But different. The envelopes had been Thomas's. The flag was hers. And the road ahead, all of it, whatever came next, that was hers too. The chapter meeting started at 7, and by 6:55, every seat was taken. That had never happened before. Not in 19 years of the chapter house on Cedar Street. Emergency sessions ran lean the core members, the people who needed to be there for whatever business required urgent attention. Tonight was different. Word had moved the way it always moved in Millhaven, and by the time Fender unlocked the main room, people were already waiting. Not just full patch members, associates, long-term prospects. Four people Jake recognized from the crowd on Main Street that afternoon who had no chapter affiliation whatsoever and had apparently decided that didn't matter tonight. Pamela from the Resource Center, still in her work clothes. Grace, the 12-year volunteer who'd driven over from the center without being asked. And Marcus Webb standing against the back wall with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has something to say and has been rehearsing it for hours. Eleanor sat in the front row. She'd gone home between the street debrief and the meeting changed her jacket. Jake noticed same worn leather, but something was different about how she was wearing it now. Straighter, less like armor, and more like a choice. She had the folded flag in her lap, and her hands were still, and she was looking at the room the way she'd looked at the Resource Center that morning, recognizing what had survived, measuring what had grown. Fender called the meeting to order. He went through the numbers first because that was how Fender ran things around the room, in fact, before you ask it to handle feeling. Total donations up 11% over last year. Supply delivery completed on both sites. 2 detours navigated, mission accomplished 4 minutes behind a revised schedule. He said it plainly and precisely, and the room received it the same way. Then he said, "There's other business." He looked at Jake. Jake stood up. He'd been running this chapter's ride for 14 years, and he'd stood in front of this room probably 200 times. He knew how to talk to these people. He knew what they responded to and what they didn't, what required elaboration, and what landed better simple. He told them about Thomas Whitmore. Not everything, not all at once. But the shape of it, the 1989 founding the endowment, the name on the legal document, the photograph Route 9. He told it clean and direct, the way you tell something true when you want people to actually hear it. He watched the room take it in the small recalibrations happening on people's faces, the particular expression of someone whose understanding of something familiar has just been fundamentally revised. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Danny said from his seat 3 rows back, "What are we going to do about it?" Jake looked at him. Danny paused, choosing words with the careful effort of someone who doesn't want to get this wrong. "We know now, we finally know, so what do we do with knowing?" Jake had been working on the answer since the parking lot of the Resource Center. 2 things, he said. First, Thomas Whitmore's name goes on the founding record of this ride, officially, permanently, alongside whoever we've had listed there before. Eleanor's name too. Both names, because both people built it, and both people should be recognized for building it, and that's a wrong we're correcting tonight. Nods around the room. Fast ones, the nods of people who recognize an obvious right thing. Second, Jake said, and here he paused because the second thing was the one that mattered more and needed to be said precisely. Eleanor Whitmore has been maintaining an alternate route for this ride for 4 years. Alone, without being asked, because she cared about this mission enough to protect it in secret. He let that land. We don't operate that way. We don't let people protect us from the outside without knowing it. Starting this year, Eleanor is part of the planning process. Route coordination, logistics, contingency. Whatever she wants to contribute. Whatever she has the energy for. He looked at Eleanor. Not as a favor. Not as an honorary role. As someone whose knowledge and judgment this ride has already proven it needs. Eleanor held his gaze. She didn't say, "I'm not a joiner." She didn't say, "I'm too old," or "I don't know enough about how you operate." She'd said all of that to herself for 6 years, and she was done saying it. "All right," she said. The room responded before Fender could call for a vote. Spontaneous, unanimous, the sound of 60 people making a collective decision without needing it formalized. And that was when Marcus stepped away from the back wall. He moved to the front of the room without being called, which was not how chapter meetings worked, and Jake almost stopped him and then didn't, because Marcus had the face of a man discharging something he'd owed for a long time, and debts like that needed their moment. "I took the photograph," Marcus said, "the one on Route 9. I took it, and I don't know how Thomas ended up with it, but he kept it 40 years and she kept it 6 more. He looked at Eleanor directly. "I was late that night. I should have been there before Thomas was, and I wasn't, and I've been carrying that for 38 years like it was a failure." He stopped. "It wasn't a failure. Thomas got there first because Thomas was the kind of man who got there first. And I got there eventually. and eventually was enough. He paused. I just needed to say that out loud, to the right people, in the right room. Eleanor said, "You drove 3 hours today." I did. "Then you're not late anymore," she said. Marcus nodded once. He went back to the wall. The room held that for a moment, the specific quiet of a group of people who have witnessed something honest and don't want to talk over it. Jake reached into his jacket pocket. He took out Thomas's letter. I didn't read it aloud. It wasn't his to read to a room. But he held it up and he said, "Thomas wrote this in his last year. He wrote it to a man he couldn't find. It found me today." He paused. "The last line is the only part I'm going to share, because the last line is the whole thing." He read it. "Stop for someone. Sit with them. Ask what they need. That's all. That's the whole thing." The room stayed quiet. Then Carla said from the second row very simply, "That's what we do." "That's what we do," Jake agreed. He folded the letter and put it back. The meeting wrapped up in 30 minutes. Practical items. The documentation changes the formal vote that passed without a single dissent. Pamela spoke briefly about what the resource center needed heading into winter, and 3 people in the room made commitments on the spot. Grace mentioned that the Whitmore supply crate had already been redistributed to the 3 families in acute shortage, and that the woman with the unread book had eaten dinner with 2 other residents tonight instead of alone, which apparently had not happened since spring. Eleanor heard that and looked at the floor for a moment, then looked back up. When the meeting ended and people began moving toward the door, the chapter filtered around Eleanor the way water filters around something solid. Not avoiding her, but acknowledging her presence as something fixed, something that was now simply part of the landscape. People shook her hand. Some said things, some just nodded. She received each one with the same patient, full presence attention she'd given to Earl, to Ruth's widower, to the 4-year-old in the parking lot. She gave everyone the same quality of her attention. That was the thing about Eleanor Whitmore. That had always been the thing. Danny was the last one to reach her before she moved toward the door. He stood in front of her with his hands in his jacket pockets in the earnest, slightly awkward energy of a 26-year-old who wants to say something significant and is not entirely sure he has the right to say it. "I'm the one who picked up the photograph," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I almost handed it back without looking at it." "But you looked." "Yeah," he paused. "I'm glad I looked." Eleanor studied him for a moment with those clear, steady eyes. "You're a good one," she said. It was exactly what Thomas Whitmore used to say. Danny didn't know that, but Jake, standing 6 feet away, heard it and felt the echo of it all the way back through 38 years to a dark road in October. And a man who pulled over for a stranger and sat in the dirt and stayed until help arrived. Danny blinked, swallowed, nodded, stepped back. Jake walked Eleanor to the door. They stood at the threshold of the chapter house for a moment, the night air coming in cold and clean, the street outside quiet now, the town settled back into its Tuesday evening self. "Same time next year," Jake said. She looked at him. "I'll be here." "I know," he said, "but next year you don't have to ask." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "He knew you'd be all right, you know, Thomas. He didn't know your name, didn't know where you went, didn't know what became of you. But he believed you'd be all right." She paused. He was right. Jake felt the letter against his chest. "He usually was," he said. Eleanor nodded once, the final nod, the one that meant the conversation was complete and the thing was true and nothing needed to be added. She tucked the folded flag more firmly under her arm, squared her shoulders, and walked down the steps of the chapter house onto Cedar Street. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because Eleanor Whitmore was not walking away from something tonight. She was walking towards something, toward whatever Tuesday came next, and the one after that, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life that was not finished, had never been finished, had simply been waiting, the way Thomas had waited on Route 9 for the exact right moment to be of use. The road had always belonged to everyone. Thomas Whitmore had known it first. Tonight, in a chapter house on Cedar Street in Mill Haven, Tennessee, 60 people had finally remembered it together, and one woman, 74 years old, wearing a worn leather jacket, carrying a folded flag, and 46 years of marriage, and 6 years of grief, and one extraordinary Tuesday in October, walked home through a town that finally knew her name. She had come asking for a ride. She left having given everyone in that town something they didn't know they were missing, proof living, in present, and undeniable. that courage doesn't age, that love outlasts the person who carries it, and that the bravest thing a human being can do is show up after a long time of standing still and say, I'm still here. I still have something to give. I'm not done yet. The road ahead was hers. It had always been hers.